Our story begins as he carries evidence of his cancer, a secret he kept while filming, as his contract wife, Sarah, keeps her distance and asks how long they have been together. He assumes she is referring to their 5-year marriage contract, and so he calmly replies that they have a little over a month left. She remains silent, but later, while traveling abroad for the new year, he hears from a friend that Sarah has been frantically searching for a specific patient. According to the director, she wants him found at any cost, even if she has to search every corner of the earth just to see him again. Dinner is ready and they could begin eating, but Sarah remains completely preoccupied with the medical records she found. She has no idea the patient is the man sitting right in front of her, and as she returns to the table, we see 3 dishes and a bowl of soup waiting. Everything prepared is one of Sarah's favorites, yet despite the effort, she seems to have no appetite at all tonight. She barely touches a bowl of rice before looking up to ask him, quite suddenly, how much time he has left. He is momentarily taken aback by the question, but soon realizes she must be talking about the end of their 5-year agreement. He tells her there is about a month remaining, having fully prepared himself for the day this arrangement would finally end. We learn that when they first married, Sarah's manager told him she hadn't just chosen him because of family pressure, but rather because he bore a striking resemblance to her first love, the man she truly adored. He was merely a substitute, a placeholder who stepped in 5 years ago after her true love had moved abroad. Now that her first love is finally returning to the country, she suddenly brings up the status of their relationship. Deep down, he knows she simply wants to clear the way for the man she actually wants to be with. As the conversation ends, he notices Sarah's glasses sliding slightly down her nose, a small detail in a heavy moment. Though his heart is breaking, he keeps his composure and tells her not to worry about the transition. He promises that when the time comes, he will leave quietly and give her the freedom she desires. He has no intention of causing her any trouble. In fact, he understands her position perfectly well. After all, she has been waiting 5 long years for her true love to return, and who could blame her, really? It was impossible. She clearly didn't want to see another man standing by her side right now. To be perfectly honest, Sarah had actually been quite kind to him over these past few years. He told himself that perhaps he shouldn't leave her in such a difficult or upsetting situation. He asked how she was doing, then mentioned he would move out early, though finding a place in the city was proving difficult. He asked her for just 3 days, promising that after that short time, he would relocate immediately. She asked if he truly wanted to move out that badly, a question that seemed to catch Sarah herself by surprise. We see a flicker of something intense, perhaps even a bit of heat, crossing her face in that moment. He couldn't quite grasp what she meant until Sarah stood up, her expression darkening as she said she wasn't asking him to leave. She told him he should simply stay there, and after saying her piece, she headed straight back to her studio. He watched her walk away, feeling utterly confused by her sudden change in behavior and what she was trying to do. Usually, Sarah wasn't the type of person to voice her personal opinions or feelings so openly. He figured if she was speaking up now, it must be important, especially since she was asking for his input on their arrangement. Naturally, he assumed she wanted to get this entire matter settled as quickly as possible. He had already suggested his own departure, which, in his mind, should have made her quite happy. And yet, she seemed strangely irritable, leaving him to try and piece together the logic behind her thoughts. We must remember, she is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, after all. She still possessed a very strict contractual mindset, and he assumed she simply didn't want to lose face. She likely wanted to honor the remaining month of their contract, as that had always been her way of doing things. Even though her attitude toward him had grown distant lately, he realized he had never actually promised her anything specific. But because she was so professional, she stuck to the contract, a trait he couldn't help but admire, really. He knew he had to find a place of his own, a sanctuary where he could truly begin to change himself. After finishing his meal, he cleaned the house, picked up the card from the coffee table, and returned to his room. The film was scheduled to be released in just 3 days, leaving him with very little time to prepare. He realized he needed to move quickly to familiarize himself with the editor and the work ahead. When he finally opened the card, he felt a flicker of genuine surprise at what he found inside. He looked over the order, which turned out to be a specific casting choice for his upcoming role. It was possible that Sarah had brought this selection along by accident when she picked up the edits. Once dinner was over, he sat at his desk and began to carefully study the clips with focused intensity. To be honest, he had always been a remarkably meticulous person when it came to his craft. No matter the task, he was the type of man who would give 100% of his effort. As for the role Sarah had secured, it was a male-centric character, despite her usual focus elsewhere. Even though it was a low-budget web series, he delved deep into the character's personality to understand his motivations. Time passed quickly as he worked, and before he knew it, the clock had already struck 9. He checked his phone, stood up, and made his way toward the kitchen to check on things. We must remember that Sarah was a complete workaholic, especially since taking over the family business in recent years. She was so preoccupied with her career that she often neglected to eat, which was hardly a healthy habit. As time went on, this lifestyle took its toll, and she eventually developed a serious liver condition. Once he learned about her illness, he went to great lengths and personal expense to help her recover. He consulted famous doctors, studied countless medical texts, and even prepared specialized herbal remedies for her. It was almost miraculous, really. Since Sarah started taking the medicine, her symptoms had finally begun to ease. And so, every single evening, he made sure to prepare a special medicinal dish just for her. Even when Sarah stayed at the office for days, he still prepared her medicine as if she were home. In his mind, supporting the well-being of those around him was simply part of his nature. To be honest, he took quite a bit of pride in the high quality of his work. The aroma of the herbs was quite potent as he finished preparing a large spread of food. He filled a large bowl with rice and made his way toward the door of her study. Just as he reached the threshold, we see him pause at the sound of Sarah's voice. She seemed to be in the middle of a phone conversation with someone. Her tone was remarkably relaxed, a far cry from the cold, professional demeanor she usually maintained. She sounded genuinely happy as she asked the person on the line if they would return soon. She promised to be there at the airport to pick them up personally. We then hear her remind the caller that her marriage to him was nothing more than a contract. In 3 years, she claimed, she hadn't even let him touch a single finger of hers. With only 2 months left on the contract, she planned to settle things with him once and for all. He waited a moment for the call to end before finally pushing the door open. Sarah looked up as he entered, and he calmly told her he had prepared some warm water. He suggested she drink it once it cooled, though deep down, he wasn't truly worried about her anymore. He set the water down and turned to leave, his duty for the evening finally complete. Suddenly, Sarah spoke up, asking him if there was anything he wanted or hoped for. He paused for a brief moment, then turned back and offered her a warm, practiced smile. He knew that Sarah had always been a woman of great ambition and joy. She had taken over the family conglomerate and even funded over a dozen primary schools. To the public, she was a philanthropist and a leader followed by many. Perhaps she realized their contract was finally coming to an end. He wondered if she simply wanted to compensate him for his time, which, in a way, was quite kind of her. Addressing her formally as CEO, he told her he would remain steadfast in his decision. Over the last 5 years, she had already paid him a staggering $500 million. During those years, she had provided him with more opportunities than he could have ever imagined. She had already given him enough, and for the moment, he truly had no other requests. He thanked her anyway, but Sarah remained silent, offering no further reply. Just as he was about to leave the room, she spoke up once more. She mentioned that she had become acquainted with a world-renowned specialist in the area. This doctor managed high-level medical cases both domestically and internationally. She was particularly skilled at treating severe spinal conditions. Sarah had already called her and promised to send over the contact information shortly. Hearing this, he felt a sudden, unexpected warmth blooming in his chest. We return to 5 years ago, when the hospital where his mentor worked was suddenly engulfed in flames. The hospital director, a woman named Dr. Chun, had rushed into the fire multiple times to save the children. She suffered not only from the burns, but from severe spinal damage caused by falling debris and intense heat. The only reason he had signed this marriage contract was to raise the money needed to treat Dr. Chun and rebuild the hospital. He had never told Sarah about any of these matters. Deep down, he believed that Sarah didn't need to be burdened by such things. It seems he might have been mistaken, and perhaps he should have investigated in secret. He truly believed she was a good woman, and he felt a quiet gratitude toward Dr. Chun. The next morning, he woke up early and prepared a lavish, hearty breakfast. He waited patiently for Sarah to wake up and join him. While staying indoors, he spent his time focused on his morning exercises. At 8:20, Sarah emerged from her room fully dressed, and we must admit, she looked truly stunning. She possessed a unique charm that seemed to elevate whatever she chose to wear. Breakfast was already on the table, kept at the perfect temperature for her. He warmed some milk and presented a wide variety of breakfast options. He invited her to see what she liked, and Sarah seemed to appreciate the gesture softly. She sat at the dining table, eating with a refined and graceful air. After all, she was a daughter of a very wealthy and influential family. Raised with the best education, every one of her movements was filled with poise and elegance. She appeared quite content, though Sarah was a woman who preferred her silence. He felt a bit awkward under her gaze, not quite knowing where to look. Just as he was preparing to return to his own room, she called out to him, mentioning she had scheduled an appointment with the specialist last night. As luck would have it, the doctor was arriving at the Northwest Hospital that very day. She told him she would arrange an appointment for him, and that he could simply call the clinic directly. He offered a small nod of thanks, while Sarah lowered her head and finished her breakfast in total silence. He returned to his room to tidy up for a moment, and shortly after, we hear the front door closing. Sarah had already left for work, and once he finished his chores, he headed out to catch a car to the hospital. Just as he was about to make a call, a sleek white car pulled up right in front of him. The window rolled down, revealing Sarah's delicate and strikingly beautiful face once again. She told him to get in so she could drive him, which, naturally, left him feeling quite confused for a moment. He was well aware of what this particular car meant to Sarah. Out of all the luxury vehicles Sarah owned, this one was special. It wasn't her flashiest car, but it was a white and gray birthday gift she held very dear. To Sarah, the importance of this specific car was on a completely different level. She didn't care about her multi-million-dollar sports cars, but she personally maintained this one to keep it pristine. She had never allowed any man to sit in this car before, and that included him. He told her not to worry and insisted he would just take a taxi instead. He joked that if the car got a single scratch, he wouldn't be able to afford the repairs. Sarah's expression shifted instantly, and he went quiet as her gaze grew colder and colder. In the end, he thanked her and carefully took his seat inside the car. The interior was incredibly quiet, but then, quite suddenly, Sarah broke the silence. Her words caught him off guard as she asked what the doctors had said during his last diagnosis. He realized then that she must have been asking Dr. Chun about his condition behind his back, and so he answered her truthfully, 2 years. Her expression shifted instantly as she asked why he had never told her. He was genuinely puzzled, as she seemed to be speaking much more than usual today. In the past, she was never one for long conversations, especially with him. But he supposed her intentions were good, even if her sudden interest felt a bit late. He addressed her formally as President Sarah, reminding her that she should focus on her work. He simply didn't want these personal matters to become a distraction or a surprise to her. Her voice rose in surprise as she reminded him that even if this was a marriage of convenience, they were still a family in the eyes of others, and he shouldn't hide such serious things. Her eyes welled up as she told him he could come to her anytime he needed anything at all. Half an hour later, after they arrived, he expressed his sincere gratitude for the ride. Sarah gave him one last look before driving away, leaving him at the hospital entrance. Once inside, we follow him as he makes his way to the third bed in the ward. Lying there was an old man, roughly 60 years of age, waiting for his visit. The man's face bore the heavy scars of a terrible fire, despite the many delicate treatments he had received. Yet, he seemed remarkably peaceful, and his face lit up with a wide, ear-to-ear grin the moment he saw him. The old man teased that work was important and he didn't need to visit every single day. He explained to his uncle that he had finally found a specialist for his specific condition. He had secured the doctor's name and knew the specialist was at the hospital today to consult with colleagues. He planned to find the doctor later, but for now, he sat by the bed to peel some fruit for the old man. He had just finished peeling half of it when a group of doctors suddenly appeared at the door. Leading the group was a tall doctor. Though she wore a mask, her striking beauty was still evident in her eyes. This was Dr. Susie, a true medical prodigy at the hospital and the one personally overseeing Uncle Ben's care. She greeted him warmly, surprised to see Luke arriving so early in the day. He stood up quickly, thanking Susie for the dedicated care she had consistently shown his uncle. Deep down, he felt an immense sense of gratitude toward this kind and talented doctor. Susie then motioned for him to step aside, speaking to Luke with a hint of concern in her voice. She asked if he was short on funds, noting that Uncle Ben's latest treatment costs had already been depleted. He understood exactly what she was getting at before she even finished her sentence, a truly awkward realization. In truth, his finances were stretched thin. The $50,000 Sarah had given him was already gone. Over the last 2 years, every cent he earned had been poured directly into these hospital bills. For a fleeting moment, he considered asking Sarah for a loan to cover the difference. But he quickly dismissed it. She owed him nothing, and their arrangement didn't cover his personal burdens. Besides, she had already looked after him quite well over the past few years, all things considered. He simply couldn't bring himself to ask, so he thanked the doctor and declined her unspoken offer. He assured her he would find a way to cover the medical expenses on his own. He felt he had to refuse her charity, as Susie had already helped him so much during these 2 years. He didn't want to take further advantage of her kindness, even as Susie sighed softly at his stubbornness. To an outsider, his distant attitude might have seemed ungrateful or even cold. But in reality, he was more disciplined and self-reliant than anyone she had ever met. She simply told him that she was there to help and to let her know if he reached his limit. She told him that unless he didn't consider her a friend, he should absolutely reach out for help if things got worse. As we see, Susie, his only real friend here, watched him go, her beautiful face hidden behind her mask as she hesitated. She seemed genuinely happy, her heart racing as she kept her eyes fixed on him even after the others had left. A voice teased her to be careful her eyes didn't fall out, just as a hand rested on Susie's snow-white shoulder. Susie turned, visibly startled to see her best friend, Nina, standing there with a mischievous look on her face. Nina squinted at her, noting that while others might be oblivious, she saw how Susie's eyes widened whenever Luke was around. Nina exposed her feelings quite ruthlessly, causing Susie's pretty face to turn an even deeper shade of crimson. Susie tried to play it cool, insisting it was just a normal interaction between a dedicated doctor and a patient's family. She argued he wasn't as intimidating as Nina made him out to be, though Nina clearly wasn't buying it. For 2 years now, Susie had cared for Uncle Ben as if he were her very own grandfather. To be honest, we rarely see a doctor go to such lengths for a single patient. It was truly exceptional. Nina wondered aloud if Susie was putting in all this extra effort just to impress the old man's nephew. She suggested that if Susie really liked him, she should simply go for it and pursue him. After all, in this day and age, who has time to play hard to get? This young man was clearly a catch. He was kind, responsible, and undeniably handsome. He was friendly, and unlike other families who brought crowds and gifts, he was the one consistently there. For 2 long years, he had been the sole person looking after his uncle every single day. Nina remarked that in today's fast-paced society, such devotion is a rare thing to witness indeed. He was always by the bedside, watching over Uncle Ben with a quiet, unwavering loyalty. As the saying goes, few remain devoted during a long illness. Yet Susie couldn't even bring herself to look Nina in the eye. He never showed even a hint of impatience. Perhaps it was this sincere devotion that surprised her and moved her to put even more effort into caring for Uncle Ben. As time went on, we see that he and Susie became much more familiar with one another. This was, in fact, a sign that the relationship between the two of them was steadily improving. We look back to a medical dispute from a year ago, where a patient's family, a group of 7 or 8 people, brought in a virus victim only to be turned away by the doctors. Another group was detained by the hospital and staff, claiming they were being denied treatment while the hospital demanded medical fees. The matter remained unresolved, and this group maliciously attacked Susie, who was the doctor on duty trying to restrain them at the time. They trapped her inside the hospital, and while some were later charged with their crimes, she remained trapped in the aftermath of that chaos. She was confined there, staying in the hospital for an entire month, an experience that felt as though it lasted for 10 long years. When Susie finally snapped out of her thoughts, she told Nina she shouldn't say such things, as Luke was already married. Nina was quite surprised by this, wondering why she had never seen his wife visit in all the time he'd been coming there. Susie explained that his wife was likely very busy, though it was a pity since Luke was such a devoted man. Nina couldn't imagine what kind of woman would be so lucky, but given how well he cared for others, his wife must be very happy indeed. Nina's heart was filled with a touch of sadness for her friend, realizing that Susie had no intentions of pursuing him now. She had been all ready to play matchmaker, but she never expected this hurdle. After all, who would have guessed he was already married? Susie's own heart was heavy with a quiet sorrow as she processed the reality of the situation. Through the doorway, she watched as Luke sat in the room, smiling and chatting warmly with Uncle Ben. A somewhat heavy atmosphere lingered as the day passed quietly, especially since his sister, Rose, had already given him a heads-up about the situation. It turned out that getting to know the doctors personally was a very good thing for them. After the latest checkup, the doctor announced that the virus affecting the old man could be completely cured with just one more course of medicine. Hearing this wonderful news, Luke felt a profound sense of relief and joy. When Luke finally returned home, he found that Rose had not yet come back. This had become a common routine. For dozens of days each year, she spent the vast majority of her time away from home, claiming work was simply too demanding. Most of those nights, she supposedly spent sleeping right there at the office. Deep down, Luke understood perfectly well that Rose was simply doing everything in her power to avoid any contact with him. It seemed she truly loved her distant moon with every fiber of her being. As far as she was concerned, she maintained the household in name only, spending 3 years focused on nothing but her business and her work. In fact, Rose's manager kept a close eye on everyone, ensuring no one, not even her own husband, got too close to her. It was after 9 in the evening when Luke finished brewing the medicine and took a taxi toward the grand office building where Rose worked. Rose's corporate headquarters featured a massive commercial lobby spanning 80 square meters. As he stepped inside, we see that the interior was bathed in golden light, looking more like a royal court than a place of business. He couldn't help but admire Rose's financial power, especially considering how much control she had managed to seize. Under her leadership, the company had become even more prosperous and dominant in the business world. Standing there, Luke felt remarkably insignificant and small, out of place in such a grand setting. He found it impossible to resist a growing sense of inferiority. When he was at home facing Rose, he somehow managed not to feel the weight of this divide. But now, standing beneath the shadow of her corporate empire, the reality of it finally dawned on him. He wondered just how vast the gap between their two worlds had truly become. He approached and politely asked for the warm medicine pack to be delivered. The vice president, a woman named Susan, reached out from her elevated position with a slender, delicate hand. Luke carefully placed the warm medicine into her hand, worried for a moment about the heat. Susan suddenly mentioned that Julian's return date had been moved up and he might even be back by tomorrow. Good night. Julian was the man Rose had been longing for over the last 3 years, and to avoid any misunderstanding, it was probably for the best that he finally stepped away from Rose's household and put it all behind him. He was already looking for a new home. Susan heard his words, but she couldn't stop herself from glaring at him. She knew his marriage to Rose was just a contract, but she had no idea he was planning to rebuild the temple at the hospital. To her, he was just a lowly commoner. That was why she was always displeased with him and never showed him a kind face. He assumed he would have to endure her irritation for just a little while longer. He hadn't expected her to be so sharp, deciding to find a new place to live before she even had a chance to speak. This was actually quite convenient, as it saved him from having to waste any more words on the matter. We see that everyone knew the true master of Rose's heart had always been Julian. That fact had never changed. If anything, this grand, sweeping love had only become more intense over time. Though he sounded a bit displeased, he reminded himself not to overthink what others were imagining. As the saying goes, a pig will never eat pork. Some things are simply beneath consideration. He felt he should have some self-awareness. After he left, he hoped he would no longer be a source of irritation for Rose. His presence only caused problems in her life, and as we know, Rose had always been a very kind person at heart. There were some things she simply couldn't bring herself to say, so Susan felt she had to say them for her. He dismissively waved his hand, feeling a slight sense of resistance to her lecture. But then, he watched as she continued to look down on him without stopping. Why should he be angry, really? This was nothing more than a simple exchange of roles. He believed there was a clear distinction now. He asked her to tell Rose that he finally understood his place. He insisted that he had never harbored any inappropriate thoughts or intentions regarding their arrangement. He promised to change his ways as soon as possible, and then he quickly walked away. Susan stood there watching him leave, feeling a sudden, unexpected pang of responsibility for her words. It seemed that, perhaps, she had said a bit too much in the heat of the moment. After all, he, Rose, and Julian had been classmates and shared many close mutual friends. We see that she had witnessed their sweet connection with her own eyes back then. That was why she felt she couldn't help but interfere when it came to those three. She told herself that what she had just said was simply helping him reach his own decision. Her goal, quite simply, was to ensure he didn't come crawling back when things got difficult. In her eyes, the man was actually proving to be quite clever by choosing to leave now. This was for the best possible outcome for everyone involved, she thought. As for Rose and Julian, he realized on his way home that he needed to pack and leave quickly. And so, as soon as he stepped through the door, he began gathering his belongings. By the time noon rolled around, he had already finished packing everything he owned. He wasn't in a desperate rush, but he knew it was time to finally move on from Rose. He waited patiently until the clock struck 6 in the evening, but she still hadn't returned, and he had no idea if she would even come home today. A little later, he took out his phone and decided to send her a brief message. He asked if she was coming back tonight, but it took a long time for Rose to reply. She simply asked what the problem was, and without overthinking it, he continued the conversation. He told her that he had already packed all of his things and could move out that very evening. He hoped she was well, adding that if she needed anything else, he would simply message her on WeChat. He even made sure to leave behind the specific recipes for her medications and health foods. He placed them on the dining room table, noting that he wouldn't be delivering her medicine anymore. He mentioned he was free for the next 2 days if she needed to finalize the divorce papers. After setting his phone down, he gave the house one last cleaning before carrying his luggage downstairs. Looking back at the home where he had spent the last 10 years, memories began to flood back. Suddenly, a coldness washed over him. Despite this being the place he had lived for so long, he still felt a lingering attachment to Rose, fearing that once he left, he might never return. He stood in reflection for a moment, then finally opened the door and stepped outside. But the very moment he opened that door, he froze in his tracks. Standing before him was a pair of piercing, sharp eyes that seemed to steal the very breath from his lungs. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. It was a look he had never seen before. Rose had always maintained a cool, elegant composure, appearing almost like an untouchable, ethereal being. No matter how angry she got, she had never looked this severe, and it made him feel quite uneasy. He wondered what he had done wrong, considering he had followed every single one of her wishes. She wanted him to move out, and he was doing so immediately, so why was she still so furious? Perhaps, deep down, he had unintentionally let a hint of his own disappointment show on his face. Regardless, she was the boss, and an employee isn't supposed to just leave whenever they feel like it. She had invested a fortune into her studio, and she expected someone to be there managing the household. Every penny she spent was worth it in her eyes, as she never lacked confidence in her investments. Now, as she stepped out, he worried she might misunderstand his departure, so he hurriedly explained that he was only taking his own things. He told her the bags only contained his clothes and personal items, even offering to open them for her inspection, or perhaps she wanted to verify her own valuables before he left. To his surprise, the CEO, let's call her Rose, simply told him she could wait. He stood there stunned, wondering if he should have spoken up at all, fearing that his words might have seemed defiant to those watching. He didn't want to cause a scene or worry anyone, so he tried to resolve it quickly, insisting he just wanted to head home. But before he could finish his sentence, Rose simply brushed past him with a cold indifference that left him feeling quite hollow. We see her walk toward the front of the room, her movements as sharp and calculated as ever. She always carried herself with a certain effortless grace, step by step. He had expected a confrontation, but this quiet, heavy atmosphere was a far more unsettling surprise. Her strides were wide and confident, making him feel increasingly out of place. He clutched his luggage and followed her inside, though he felt a growing sense of dread the moment he crossed the threshold. He dragged his suitcase along, half expecting he might have to explain himself one last time. After all, a powerful CEO like Rose had a public image to maintain, even in her own home. She had to protect her reputation, though perhaps she should have looked after herself first. When he first entered this house 10 years ago, he had absolutely nothing to his name. Back then, he only owned a few cheap changes of clothes. Over the years, he had upgraded his wardrobe, as he couldn't exactly look like a pauper while living as Rose's husband. If he looked disheveled, it would reflect poorly on her image. Besides, as an actor, he had to maintain a certain standard in the entertainment industry, where appearances are everything. Aside from his clothes, his luggage was mostly filled with books, quite a lot of them, actually. He didn't want her to think he was some beggar clinging to her wealth. Very few people could resist the temptation of such luxury, but he was determined to leave with his dignity intact. He asked if she wanted to check the bags, but Rose, or rather, Sarah, as she was known to her friends, just looked at him with eyes full of resentment. "Take your things back to your room," she commanded. Her tone was severe as she walked toward her studio and slammed the door. He stood there in a daze, completely confused by her demand that he stay. He wondered if she intended to personally inspect every item before letting him go. Rose was a legendary businesswoman, a true professional in every sense of the word, but in her personal life, she often seemed lost. She was prone to forgetting the simplest things, despite the many accolades and trophies she had won over the years. It seemed she had forgotten the weight of those achievements, or perhaps she had simply lost track of what truly mattered in the quiet corners of her home. He realized that for all her success, there were gaps in her memory that no trophy could fill. She was a woman of many prizes, yet she seemed to have forgotten the most important ones. He stood there, reflecting on the many things she had overlooked, while vividly remembering every word Rose had spat at him the night before. The plan was simple. Whenever she brought her old flame, Mark, home for the night, he was expected to find an excuse to leave and stay in a hotel. He spent the entire day at home, burying himself in his scripts to keep his mind occupied. When he finally looked up from his work, he realized with a start that it was already past 5 o'clock. In that moment, a familiar tension began to tighten in his chest as the evening approached. Mark should be arriving any minute now, shouldn't he? It was a thought he couldn't quite shake. We see that Sarah had spent years neglecting her husband, leaving him feeling like a ghost in his own home. She was likely feeling particularly excited right now, wasn't she? To be honest, he didn't want to know the answer. He wondered what they were doing at that very moment, and despite his best efforts, he found himself lost in those painful thoughts. Deep down, he felt incredibly insecure, especially when he compared himself to a man as successful as Mark. Mark didn't just come from a prestigious family, he was also undeniably handsome, which only added to the sting. He had even heard that the man possessed a charming personality, the kind that everyone seemed to adore. Mark was excellent in every possible way. By comparison, he felt like a nobody, an orphan with no family legacy to lean on. He was merely a low-tier actor, someone who was only ever cast in minor, forgettable roles. He felt completely overshadowed, as if he were standing in the path of a giant. It wasn't surprising that someone as impressive as Sarah would be drawn to a man like that. The handsome Mark clearly adored her. He couldn't say he was still in love with Sarah, but in this moment, he felt the weight of it all. He still felt a flicker of resentment toward Mark. He picked up his phone, only to see a photo of Mark and Sarah together. He had to admit, even from a man's perspective, that Mark was exceptionally good-looking. Looking at the photo, he felt the man appeared perfect, without a single flaw to be found. Sarah and Mark sat together in the image, looking for all the world like a match made in heaven. Looking at the screen, Mark and Sarah truly did look like a match made in heaven. He couldn't help but wonder if she had ever truly considered a real future with him. He tried his absolute best to look away, to focus on anything else. But his eyes kept drifting back to the photo, where Sarah's face was radiant with a genuine smile. She possessed a certain softness in that image, a side of her he had never actually seen. It seemed she knew how to smile, but that warmth was reserved only for the person she loved. To her, he was merely an employee, someone who had never been worthy of such a smile. With a heavy sigh, he finally set the phone aside and tried to let the feeling go. His mood was somber, and he certainly didn't have the energy to worry about cooking dinner. He decided to order some food to the house, though the silence of the rooms felt strange. If he wanted to start his life over, he could have easily gone to a hotel or found a new place. Yet, for some reason, he felt fortunate just to be having a quiet meal at home. A little while later, the sudden sound of the doorbell echoed through the hallway. Suddenly, a wave of unease washed over him, even though he was expecting his food delivery. Who could be ringing at this hour? Perhaps it was someone from the management office. He walked over and opened the door, only to feel his heart sink instantly. It was Sarah. Why on earth was she back so early? By all accounts, she should have been spending every moment of the evening with Mark. Wasn't she supposed to be at a hotel, finally sharing her true feelings with him? He peered out past the doorway, but to his surprise, she was standing there entirely alone. He looked past her, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. "What are you looking for?" she asked sharply. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, and he quickly looked away, insisting he wasn't looking at anything at all. "Are you back for the night?" he asked casually, trying to mask the awkwardness of the moment. Sarah's voice flared with sudden irritation as she reminded him that this was, after all, her home. He wondered if she had enjoyed being pampered by her husband, but he didn't dare utter those words aloud. Without thinking, he stepped aside to let her into the room, realizing he had no right to keep her out. We must remember that Sarah was a woman of great pride and in many ways, quite traditional. Her sense of dignity simply wouldn't allow her to fully commit herself to someone on a first meeting. In truth, Luke had always known that despite her marriage, she had been pursued by many over the years. Many impressive men had tried to win her over, yet she never showed them much kindness or interest. Perhaps the long years spent apart while she was abroad had made their reunion feel somewhat strained. He assumed that once they spent more time together, she would eventually open her heart completely. Seeing the takeout bags, she asked if he hadn't cooked, wondering why he was being so lazy today. He asked if she had eaten, knowing full well she had just shared a Western-style dinner with Mark. He felt he shouldn't let her cook, yet she kept questioning why he was acting so strangely. Suddenly, her gaze shifted toward the table where his phone was still lying face up. He felt a jolt of panic, remembering that he had left the photo of her and Mark displayed on the screen. To make matters worse, he had even zoomed in on the image, and Sarah saw it immediately. Her expression grew tense, and as he watched her, a deep, visible blush began to creep across her face. He scrambled to grab the phone and hide it behind his back, rendered completely speechless by the embarrassment. He had opened the image by accident, and in that moment, he wished the floor would simply swallow him whole. The embarrassment was lethal. He had completely forgotten to lock his screen after looking at the photo of her. As he looked at Sarah, he felt as though she had lost all will to deal with him in that moment. A faint, unreadable smile played on her lips while he kept his gaze firmly fixed on the floor. He was too mortified to notice the surprisingly soft expression on her beautiful face. She simply remarked that eating too much wasn't good for one's health, a fair point, to be honest. After dropping that single comment, Sarah turned and hurried straight into her studio. Luke let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling the tension finally escape. It seemed she hadn't dwelled on the photo. After all, her heart was still occupied by Mark. Deep down, he suspected she didn't care much about what he thought anyway, which is a bit sad, really. He whistled a low tune, telling himself he wasn't a fool and had no reason to worry before finishing his meal. He gathered the empty takeout containers and set them aside, just as he was preparing to head back home. From a distance, we see a wealthy-looking man approaching the area with an air of confidence. It was her first love, Mark. One has to wonder what exactly he was doing there at that hour. Luke gave a quiet whistle of realization, so this was how things were going to be. A little later, he found himself questioning why Sarah had actually returned home so early. It was strange that she wasn't still out spending time with her beloved Mark. As it turned out, they were already settled in, seemingly ready to put the day behind them. It felt almost ridiculous to him. He had assumed Sarah was still out and about. He had imagined her at home, perhaps lost in thought about her own complicated feelings. It seemed she was lost in deep thought. After all, she was a woman profoundly in love. She had resented him for so long that she perhaps didn't dare to leave, but the sight made Luke feel incredibly uneasy. In that moment, he found himself debating whether he should even return to the room or just disappear. He felt he should probably make a quick exit to give the couple some space. After all, he was just a tired patient, wasn't he? Or perhaps he should go back and say goodbye to Sarah one last time before slipping away for good. As Mark approached, Luke couldn't help but offer a silent round of applause in his mind for the man's presence. The man was undeniably handsome, and to be honest, his features were strikingly similar to Luke's own. If they were walking down the street together, people might easily mistake them for brothers. It finally made sense why Sarah had been willing to spend so much money on a contract marriage with him. Looking at such a similar face, he felt a strange, heavy mixture of luck and profound sadness. He was lucky because this face had caught Sarah's eye, allowing him to earn the money needed for Uncle Ben's treatment. And yet, he felt a deep sadness for the exact same reason. His face was just a shadow. His appearance had become nothing more than a tool, and he began to feel like a mere placeholder in her life. He wondered if his so-called good fortune was really just a hollow imitation of another man's existence. It was a bitter realization, to be sure, understanding that he was only there to fill a void. Shaking off the thought, he prepared to head toward the elevator and leave them to their private reunion. He felt like a temporary guardian, watching over a world that didn't truly belong to him. Crystal was waiting for him to bring things up, and he couldn't stay lingering in the hallway forever. He quickly forced a polite smile onto his face, masking the quiet turmoil beneath his calm exterior. Sarah was his employer, and the man standing before him was the one she truly loved, a simple, painful reality. She viewed him as a professional, and as a professional himself, Luke knew he had to fulfill his responsibilities. Mark paused for a moment, then offered a polite smile and a quick word of thanks. After leading Mark upstairs, Luke immediately went to inform Sarah of her visitor's arrival. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the studio and called out from the doorway to see what was happening. Sarah's cold voice rang out as he watched her from the entrance, informing her that her boyfriend had come to find her. There was no answer from inside at first, but a moment later, Sarah opened the door and looked directly at Luke. Her eyes flickered with emotion before she hurried into the studio, where she saw Mark sitting at the table. "How did you get here?" Sarah asked with a strained, nervous smile as she went to sit beside him. Luke felt a wave of surprise. He had simply assumed they would meet right there in the hallway. Mark explained that he'd heard from a friend about her recent move and had come specifically to see her new home. He complimented her beauty, noting that this was his very first time visiting her in this new space. When she offered him a tour, they both stood up and began to look around the apartment together. As they reached the door to Luke's room, Mark sounded genuinely surprised by what he saw. He remarked on the minimalist style he loved so much, wondering if Sarah had prepared the room specifically for him. He even noticed the specific decor, remembering how he had only briefly mentioned his preference for it once before. He admitted how much he liked it, never imagining she would actually go through the trouble of buying it all. Luke returned from the kitchen after cutting some fruit, overhearing their conversation and seeing how kind Sarah appeared. His expression turned quiet as he realized the entire room had been decorated to match Mark's specific tastes. To be honest, Luke liked the style too, simple, quiet, and beautiful, especially the musical instruments. But he knew he didn't belong in this world. In this life, he was nothing more than a stranger in someone else's home. We see a memory of a foreigner who helped him clear out the trash. Thanks to his own hard work, Luke had managed to get into a prestigious music academy. It was a top-tier school, and because of that, he had grown to truly love music. But now, as he looked over at the instruments in the room, he felt like he couldn't even look them in the eye. He could only think of the piano he loved. Every day, whenever Sarah was away, he would spend some time listening to its music. Unfortunately, on that particular day, Sarah returned earlier than expected just to pick up a piece of paper. Occasionally, in the quiet of his room, he would find himself playing the instruments. He still remembered how bright and cheerful Mark's face looked back then. It felt like being submerged in water, and the notes he played reached a piercingly high volume. Sarah had snapped, asking who gave him permission to touch the piano, forbidding him from ever playing it again without her consent. At that moment, he realized she was simply afraid he might break it. It was an expensive piece of equipment, after all. He apologized repeatedly, promising he would never touch it again. Only now did he understand that the piano had been bought specifically to match Mark's aesthetic. Sitting at the table, Luke felt momentarily invisible, blocked out of their private world. When Sarah and Mark returned to the room, Luke stood up and politely offered Mark some fruit. He explained that he had things to do that evening and asked them to excuse him. He made his exit quickly, heading straight back to his room to give them space. He grabbed a change of clothes and prepared to head out, sensing that Mark might be staying the night. He felt it was best to leave quickly to avoid any awkward or miserable situations. Sarah suddenly looked at him, her expression shifting to one of clear annoyance as she asked where he was going. She questioned what he could possibly have to do, leaving him with a hollow feeling as he processed the coldness of the moment. She looked at him sharply, asking what he was still thinking about, and if he really thought she had come there just to be a third wheel. Luke couldn't help but think how much this woman had changed. He had no objections to her presence, of course, and had long since given up on any extra expectations. He seemed to relax a bit more, his expression softening as he let out a quiet, weary sigh. Deep down, he felt like a man who had finally put down a heavy basket he'd been carrying for far too long. As he let go of his burdens, a small flicker of joy remained, and he felt a strange sense of gratitude toward her. To be honest, even as a professional who fit every ideal of a dedicated worker, he didn't have any strange feelings about seeing people express love or even hearing their hidden secrets. As he turned to leave, Sarah let out another surprised cry. Just as she was about to step out, she found herself lingering near Mark once again. She asked him in a gentle tone why he wasn't resting yet, since it was already so late. Mark suddenly felt a wave of unease wash over him. He realized she had prepared something for the night, even bringing a vanity bag in her purse. She certainly hadn't expected to be sitting there for only a moment. Half an hour later, Sarah actually gave him the order to leave. However, what she said next was something Mark had never expected from her. She told him she had an early morning meeting and needed to use the night to study some materials. It was a dismissal, plain and simple. Hearing this, Mark said nothing and simply stood up, his hair a bit messy. Yes, work is important after all. He asked if she had time tomorrow for a movie, but she replied she would be busy with several meetings. Mark found himself with nothing left to say. She gave him a peculiar smile, mentioning she wouldn't be going abroad again soon and there would be plenty of time later. As Mark prepared to depart, he looked at Luke deeply. The intensity in his eyes gave Luke a sudden, involuntary shiver. This man clearly resented him, which left Luke quite speechless. Sarah had rejected him because of Luke's presence, even though Luke was trying his best to give them space. He realized then that he should leave immediately. Many questions began to flood his mind, and he couldn't help but ask Sarah if she had told Mark everything yet. Sarah's beautiful face instantly turned cold. She asked what exactly she was supposed to have told him, her expression growing even more icy. Luke explained that while he was poor, he wasn't a thief, and she was free to check his things to ensure nothing was missing. After he finished speaking, he suddenly felt a chilling draft around him. He looked up to meet Sarah's eyes, and for a moment, they looked cold enough to kill. She asked him if he found the situation funny. Luke tried to explain that he simply couldn't understand her logic, thinking it would be better for everyone if he just left. He wanted to leave early so everyone could be happy, a win-win for all, or so he thought. But she only stared back with a cold, dissatisfied expression. Without saying another word, she stepped into the audition room and shut the door behind her. As the door clicked shut, we see Luke standing there alone. Her voice turned ice-cold as she reminded him that their contract wasn't over yet. She had paid him, and she expected him to stay until the very last second. She dared him to even think about leaving that house. Once the door was fully closed, Luke realized he hadn't expected this leading lady to act like such a witch. It was quite a contrast to the public image she maintained, where she always appeared so full of love and grace for those around her. We see that her suitors were many, and while some thought she was a saint who helped others, Luke was beginning to see a much sharper side to her personality. He felt as though he were under a microscope, facing a storm 100 times stronger than expected. His aunt didn't scold him, however, she just watched. She simply laughed, clearly enjoying his awkwardness. She joked that if she had a puppy like him at home, she wouldn't get any rest at all, leaving Luke's face frozen. He had no way to respond to that. She quickly returned to the script with a smirk, telling him not to feel pressured since his role was just a minor military officer. The role didn't have many scenes and wasn't very demanding. A short while later, they arrived at the TV market where the filming was set to take place. It was only 8 in the morning, and the crew was still busy setting up. Luke's manager, Ryan, led him directly toward the production team. Since he didn't have many scenes, the director had only seen his photo. At the time, the director had approved him mostly as a favor to Ryan. This was Luke's first time meeting the director in person, a man in his 50s who had once been a very famous figure in the television industry. He had produced many hits in the past, but lately, his luck had run dry. After several failed projects, the industry had slowly begun to forget him. Now he was reduced to filming web dramas, though he still carried the weight of his years of experience. His eyes, hidden behind thick glasses, were sharp. He looked Luke up and down, exerting a silent pressure. He noted that Luke looked even better in person than in his photos, which was a promising start. Luke, playing the part of the humble newcomer, said he hoped to learn a lot from the director's critiques. He kept his tone sharp and professional. The director mentioned that he and Ryan were old friends, so anyone Ryan brought along had to be good. He encouraged the young man to do his best. The director, Mr. Yates, gave him an encouraging pat on the shoulder, but their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a massive commotion from the crowd outside. It was actually Julian. We see the crowd whispering in disbelief, wondering why a star as handsome and famous as Julian would ever join our humble production. Just a few days ago, the lead was supposed to be someone else. How Julian, a star of his magnitude, ended up in a low-budget web drama was a mystery to everyone. The director had certainly pulled off a miracle. Upon hearing Julian's name, we see a tall, striking young man emerge, catching everyone off guard. Word was he specifically wanted to play the secondary male lead and even accepted a very low salary. He seemed to have a lingering attachment to this project. In a low-budget series like this, one wouldn't expect an A-list star like Julian, or even a B-list actor, to show any interest whatsoever. The fact that Julian was willing to step down for a special appearance had kept the director, Mr. Yates, awake all night with excitement. "Luke, your luck has arrived," Ryan whispered. Ryan was visibly thrilled, noting that having an A-list star would boost the show's profile immensely. If Luke played his cards right, he could ride Julian's coattails to fame. Luke could only manage a forced smile. While others wondered why Julian would stoop to a low-budget web drama, Luke knew the truth all too well. He suspected Julian was there specifically for him. He watched discreetly as Julian, surrounded like a celestial body by fans, turned his gaze toward him until their eyes met. Julian quickly looked away, making it clear he had no intention of saying hello. Luke, for his part, wasn't about to provoke him either, but Ryan had other plans. A star like Julian isn't someone an ordinary person can just approach. Ryan saw this as a golden opportunity to increase Luke's popularity and wasn't about to let it slip. Luke wanted to decline, but Ryan was already waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Julian, hello. I'm Ryan from Horizon Entertainment, and this is Luke." Ryan introduced Luke as the actor playing the fifth male lead. After being put on the spot like that, Luke had no choice but to offer a greeting with a strange smile. "Hello, Mr. Julian," Luke said. Julian's eyes, usually as bright as the sun, held a flicker of a smile as he simply acknowledged him as Mr. Julian in return. Ryan continued, explaining that Luke was a newcomer from a small company and asking Julian to look after him. Seeing Luke standing there so awkwardly, Ryan tried his best. Young people shouldn't always think about making connections. They must focus on their craft. Acting matters more than anything else, Julian said, his voice turning cold. His words left no room for debate. The atmosphere on set suddenly turned icy, and everyone couldn't help but stare at Luke. In the entertainment industry, this was quite a scene. Usually, everyone tries to maintain a facade of peace and harmony. It was incredibly strange for someone like Julian to criticize a newcomer so openly. It seemed Luke had been marked. Immediately, the crowd began to distance themselves from Luke out of fear. Ryan was fuming, realizing his attempt to get close to the big star had backfired spectacularly. Luke certainly hadn't wanted this outcome. Once Julian finally walked away, Ryan turned to Luke, looking at him with a mix of frustration and intense excitement. Ryan turned to Luke and asked if he had offended Julian. After all, why else would a massive star go out of his way to humiliate him? Luke could only offer a weary smile. As a professional, he had no intention of making his complicated history with Julian public knowledge. Besides, Julian was a major celebrity whose smallest actions caused ripples, and Luke hadn't expected him to be so openly petty. Ryan, who had once admired Julian, now found his opinion shifting rapidly. He was an idol, yes, but Ryan was loyal to his own artist. He kept encouraging Luke, insisting that his friend was better than Julian anyway. "Regardless," Ryan noted, "you don't have many scenes together." Luke felt he could simply avoid him. He realized his character mostly appeared in the female lead's memories, so they wouldn't share the screen. Suddenly, the assistant director's voice boomed across the set, shouting at the young man standing before him with surprising aggression. We see the scene being filmed, where a character declares with deep emotion that he had always thought she would be his only one. The assistant director, Mr. Fong, erupted in a sudden rage, screaming, "Luke, what on earth are you doing? If you can't do the job properly, then get out of here right now," he continued, his face red with anger. He demanded to know if Luke realized he was wasting everyone's time. The outburst was so sudden it silenced the entire crew. To be honest, Luke's performance seemed perfectly fine. It was full of emotion and felt incredibly grounded. No one understood where the director's anger was coming from. Luke simply apologized, taking the blame despite his inner confusion. Mr. Fong was projecting a wild, aggressive persona, but deep down, it seemed he was masking his own insecurities. Luke asked for another take, adjusting his mindset and pouring every ounce of his genuine feeling back into the character. However, no matter how well he performed the scene, he found it impossible to satisfy Mr. Feng's arbitrary demands. The insults and the shouting only grew more severe as the afternoon wore on. It was becoming quite a spectacle. The crew began to realize that Luke's acting wasn't the problem at all. The assistant director was clearly targeting him on purpose. "Luke, what are you doing? What kind of character are you even trying to portray here?" Fong barked again. It was clear that Mr. Fong had decided he didn't want Luke in this role, and he was making it known in the loudest way possible. The director barked for someone to take him away, threatening him with the lowest possible pay for his performance. It was a bitter pill to swallow, as if he were being forced to eat scraps from a small, failing shop. But the way they handled his contract and his role felt like a betrayal of everything they had previously promised. Luke wanted to argue, but he simply waved it off, gently brushing back his hair and refusing to show any signs of suspicion. The only explanation was that Julian was causing trouble behind the scenes, and the sheer insult of it made Luke's eyes burn with frustration. Ryan told him not to worry, insisting that if this web drama failed, it failed. He promised to help Luke find something much better. Luke managed a bright smile as they left the studio, though Ryan remained tense, insisting he would drive Luke wherever he needed to go. Luke explained he had found a new place to stay but hadn't confirmed it yet, thinking he might focus on making videos in the future. Ryan asked why he didn't look for a place closer to the studio and offered his help to secure a better location. Luke declined, calling it a minor issue, and watched Ryan head back to the office before starting his own walk home. Suddenly, a middle-aged woman approached him with an eager look, asking if he was indeed Luke. She insisted that he come with her immediately, claiming that Mr. Song wanted to see him. Luke hadn't paid much attention to him before, and until today, he hadn't held any particularly negative impressions of the man. However, after witnessing the man's petty actions on set, Luke found the very thought of him quite nauseating. He usually had a good temperament, but that didn't mean he was a doormat for others to step on. The woman looked him over, commenting on how thin he looked, and tried to pull him along with her. She began shouting orders at him, and Luke coldly remarked that a good dog shouldn't block the path. He tried to step around her to catch a ride, but the woman, shocked by his words, grabbed his hand firmly. She demanded to know who he was calling a dog, while Luke, now truly angry, told her to let go of him. She refused to release him, leaving Luke wondering just how far this absurdity was going to go. She sneered, telling him that an invitation from Mr. Song was a stroke of luck he didn't deserve in 8 lifetimes. A person like him, she insisted, would never have even seen a man like Mr. Song if it weren't for the man's sudden whim. She snapped, asking if he actually dared to show dissatisfaction, just as the man himself, Mr. Song, approached them. The woman immediately complained to Mr. Song, calling Luke ungrateful for having the audacity to refuse his invitation. We see the middle-aged woman glaring at Luke with deep dissatisfaction, clearly expecting him to cower. Mr. Song looked on with an air of profound self-importance, wearing a smile that was, frankly, quite ridiculous. He suggested that if Luke wanted to talk, they should find a more appropriate place than the middle of the street. A little later, inside a quiet cafe, Luke looked Mr. Song directly in the eye and asked what he wanted. Mr. Song noted that after today's events, it was clear that one word from him could end Luke's career instantly. With a condescending expression, he asked Luke if he truly believed he and Julia belonged in the same world. Luke simply gestured dismissively, asking if he had been summoned there just to witness a display of the man's ego. Mr. Song shook his head, telling Luke that he lacked the basic qualities to even stand in his presence. He claimed he had only invited Luke there to make one thing perfectly clear to him. In this world, he said, there are no fairy tales, and a queen would never fall in love with a common pig. To him, it was a simple fact of life. A pig could never become a prince, no matter how hard it tried. He suggested that Julia had only worked with Luke and kept him around for her own amusement. She had used him as a mere placeholder, a fact Mr. Song assumed Luke was already well aware of. Now that he had returned, he asked Luke if he really thought he could continue to hold on to her. Luke looked at him calmly, noting that the man was clearly overthinking a situation that didn't exist. He had always known his place, he said, and he had never once harbored any delusions of grandeur. Mr. Song nodded, telling Luke that it would be better if he moved out of Julia's house immediately. He admitted, with a cold smile, that he didn't like anyone being quite so close to her. Luke replied that he was already looking for a new place, prompting Mr. Song to slide his phone across the table. He revealed that these were the private messages he had been exchanging with Julia lately. He invited Luke to take a look, claiming he had no idea what she was even trying to achieve with him. We see Luke lower his gaze, reluctantly reading the conversation between the man and Julia. In the messages, Mr. Song asked if she would finally make Luke leave her house once the contract ended. He pointed out that Luke's health was failing and asked if she truly felt nothing for the man after all this time. He even noted that Luke was quite handsome, but Julia's reply was cold. Their relationship was strictly business. She insisted she was a practical person, despite Luke having looked after her for the past 3 years. Mr. Song had pushed further, saying he would be very uncomfortable if she didn't actually want Luke to leave. Julia had promised to find time to talk to Luke, telling Mr. Song not to overthink the situation. To her, she claimed, Luke was merely a subordinate colleague she had worked with for many years. Luke looked away, having no interest in reading any more of her messages, which was understandable, really. He pushed the phone back toward the man as a strange, hollow feeling began to settle in his chest. A subordinate colleague? To be perfectly honest, that was exactly what he was to her. And so it went for 8 long years. They lived under the same roof, yet barely a word passed between them. She had always been the one carrying the weight, looking after him day in and day out while he remained distant. He never offered a response, except for those brief moments every 2 weeks when it was time to settle the bills. He never showed her any warmth. It seemed that even after 8 years, they were nothing more than roommates who shared a space, but no connection. There was no real care there, was there? In that regard, we can almost feel Julia's growing frustration. Mr. Song clearly wanted Luke to leave, yet his own sense of morality wouldn't let him stay silent. Luke couldn't quite understand it. He had tried to leave before, but Julia had never allowed it. He wondered what she was thinking, or if she simply lacked the resolve to make a final decision. This time, he felt he should truly leave without a goodbye, perhaps just moving on to the next chapter. Perhaps that was simply how another person would have handled a situation like this. He wanted an end to it all. While downstairs in her 79th floor executive office, Julia was on the phone. She asked Dr. Young for an update, only to hear the grim news that things were not going well. The doctor explained that the issues with the patient's spine were becoming incredibly serious. Too much time had already passed, even though he had told Luke that a full recovery was possible. But in reality, and this is the heartbreaking part, he likely only had 2 months left to live. On the other end of the line, we can hear Julia's breath hitch as the weight of the news hits her. Her expression faltered completely as she asked if there truly wasn't any other way to save him. She insisted money was no object, but the doctor noted this condition was currently incurable everywhere. With enough funding, they could perhaps buy him a little more time. However, that time would only bring the patient more pain, leaving Julia standing in stunned silence. She reminded the doctor of his expertise, pleading with him as the professional she trusted most. She begged him not to worry about the costs, which tells us everything about her hidden desperation. She demanded he receive the best medical care possible, and the doctor promised to do what he could. After that, Julia's call came to an end, leaving her alone with the cold reality of the situation. We see him lying back in his chair, feeling a strange, persistent ringing in his heart that he couldn't quite ignore. It was in that moment that the deepest, most profound ache began to surface within him. He couldn't help but remember the day Julia first suggested that they should go their separate ways. She had told him to focus on his professional studies instead, a memory that, for some reason, kept looping in his mind. Yes, she wanted him to study, to move on, and to leave their life behind. To be honest, it was a lot to process. To drown out the grief, he followed his best friend, Jason, to a local hotel bar to block out the world. Now, Luke never actually liked drinking. In fact, he quite hated the loss of control that came with it. But that day, after just 1 glass, he realized it was the only way to numb the agony in his chest. It was then that he first saw a young man named Leo performing on the stage. Leo's voice was effortless and soothing, and as he looked down at his guitar, his expression reminded Luke of Julia. It felt like a battle where his inner shadows were winning, and suddenly, his old emotional scars were ripped wide open. He found himself drawn to that voice, returning to the bar day after day, sitting in silence just to listen. He would wait for Leo to take the stage, finding a strange comfort in watching his face and hearing him sing. Only in those fleeting moments could his wounded, aching heart find a shred of peace and quiet. Later on, we learned that Leo had caught the attention of a talent manager who saw his potential. Leo was a young man who had recently left university to pursue a much more difficult path. He was desperate for money, taking on every odd job he could find just to stay afloat. He worked tirelessly, constantly moving from one video shoot to the next in a blur of activity. He spent his days jumping between film sets and his nights singing in bars like this one. And to make matters even more complicated, his family was currently pressuring him to get married. That night, as Leo finished his set and prepared to leave, Luke called him into a private room to speak with him. He offered him a formal partnership, and even now, he can still remember the look of pure surprise and joy on Leo's face. In that moment, Luke felt certain that the young man would be an excellent partner for the role he had in mind. And to be honest, Leo has lived up to that over the years, handling every aspect of Luke's life without a single mistake. We see Luke pick up his phone and decide to make an important call. On the other end, his friend Zach answers, surprised that Luke is calling him so late in the day. Luke explains that he needs a favor, asking Zach if he still has any medical contacts over in the United States. He asks if Zach can help him find a world-class spinal specialist for a very important case. He makes it clear that money is no object, even if they have to look in other countries to find the best care. Zach asks if something has happened to him, but Luke quickly reassures him that he isn't the one who is ill. He explains that it is for a close friend who is suffering from a serious spinal condition. Zach agrees to do his best to help and promises to call Luke back as soon as he finds a suitable lead. Meanwhile, Leo has been searching for a new place to stay in the city, but he hasn't found the right house yet. He decides to keep looking, sending his information to a couple of agencies to see what they can find for him. Later, he calls Tim, the man looking after his Uncle Ben, to check in and see how the old man is doing. Only after confirming that everything is stable does he finally head back home, moving quietly through the night. This time, he is determined to leave his current situation, packing his things and booking a room at a cheap hotel. That evening, we find him alone in his room, eating a simple bowl of instant noodles for dinner. Suddenly, while he is at the hotel, his phone begins to ring. It is a call from Luke. Luke sounds incredibly worried as he demands to know where Leo has gone and why he left so suddenly. Luke's voice on the other end is cold, laced with a sharp edge of anger. He demands to know where Leo has gone, and Leo calmly explains he is staying at a hotel for now. Leo had promised himself he would be honest about his departure, and he intends to keep that promise. A heavy silence follows before Luke speaks again, insisting that Leo return to him immediately. But Leo has already reached his limit, wondering what more Luke could possibly want from him at this stage. He realizes he can no longer avoid the confrontation, telling Luke plainly that he doesn't see any reason to return. When Luke asks what he means, Leo takes a breath and reminds him there is only 1 month left on the contract, and Zach is already back. He points out that if he stays, neither Zach nor Luke would truly be happy with the arrangement. Leo continues his logic, calculating that at $50,000 for 3 years, he owes roughly $1.4 million for the final month. Just 1 month remains, totaling that $1.4 million in remaining value. He assures Luke that he will find a way to pay him back that final amount in full. However, because of his current expenses, he admits the payment might be a little late as he settles his affairs. On the other end, Luke's voice drops to a whisper, his breathing growing tense, as if he's fighting back a wave of disbelief. Leo feels a slight pang of sadness, reminding Luke that he had already promised Zach he would find a way to make Leo leave. There is no need to keep arguing. Luke is simply doing what he said he would do, isn't he? He tells Luke not to be nervous, assuring him that he isn't the type of person to go around gossiping. He won't say a word to anyone, and he certainly won't do anything to tarnish Luke's reputation or character. Deep down, Leo suspects Luke is only afraid that a few loose words might damage his prestigious name. After all, Luke is the face of a massive company with significant market capital at stake. Even the smallest hint of a scandal could cause the value of Luke's entire industry to take a serious hit. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. Leo assumed his words had finally hit home, and he felt a sudden, tearful release. He felt truly liberated at last, and with a lighter heart, he quickly finished his simple meal. A little later, we see him standing before the bathroom mirror, looking at his own reflection. He began practicing his expressions, knowing that since he had nothing left, he had to rely entirely on his acting skills. Since arriving in this world, he had spent nearly every spare moment practicing in front of a mirror, honing the performance he gave today. He knew he had to keep moving forward, especially for Uncle Ben, whose medical treatments required a small fortune to maintain. The thought of the $1.4 million he owed Luke weighed heavily on him, but eventually, exhaustion took over and he prepared for bed. But just as he was settling in, a sudden, persistent knocking at the door filled him with a sense of deep unease. Wondering who could possibly be visiting at this hour, he slipped on his shoes, got up, and cautiously peered toward the entrance. He was completely caught off guard. Had Luke actually managed to track him down here? His heart raced with surprise as he wondered why the man would come all this way, leaving him momentarily paralyzed by confusion. To be honest, it wasn't that surprising that Luke had found this place, given his resources. Luke's family possessed a vast network of connections, making it trivial for him to locate someone in a local hotel. Still, Leo couldn't understand why he would show up in the middle of the night after everything had been made so clear. He wasn't sure how to handle the situation, but as he reached the door, he realized that staying silent would only make things worse. Stealing his resolve, he finally reached out and turned the handle of the door lock. As the door swung open, he was met by Luke's striking eyes, which seemed to shimmer like distant stars. Luke stared directly at him, his face a mask of cold indifference that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. He told Leo to pack his things and return with him immediately, while Leo simply stood there, watching him in stunned silence. It was clear Luke had rushed here. His hair was slightly unkempt, and he was still wearing his professional work suit. We see that Luke was always the type of person who truly appreciated the finer things in life. He wasn't particularly fond of hard liquor, but he often enjoyed a quiet glass of red wine at home. Usually, after a long day at the office, the first thing he would do was change out of his professional attire. He must have seen Leo leaving work and decided to track him down immediately, using his many connections. He found the hotel where Leo was staying and came over at once, though Leo truly couldn't understand why. What exactly was he doing? He clearly wanted Leo gone, yet here he was, making this grand gesture. Leo wondered what this could possibly mean, as he had no intention of ever going back. He had already admitted everything and made his position perfectly clear, or so he thought. Was Luke acting out simply because Ben had returned home that day? It seemed a bit petty, to be honest. Luke remained silent, but his expression made Leo feel increasingly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. Leo wondered how Luke could even say such things, and if he truly appeared that suspicious. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Leo felt his face beginning to flush with a slight, nervous heat. He spoke up quickly, telling Luke not to worry because he would absolutely keep his word. He insisted he had no ulterior motives, acknowledging that Luke and Ben were the ones who truly belonged together. He reminded him that their marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement born from a contract. He had known the terms since the day he signed, and he would never harbor such unrealistic expectations. He pleaded with Luke not to misunderstand him, but as Luke listened, his demeanor shifted. A heavy silence fell between them, and Luke seemed to grow quietly, inexplicably angry at those words. Finally, Luke pointed out that the contract had not yet reached its official end date. He told Leo that he wasn't permitted to leave just yet and ordered him to return home immediately. Leo refused him, his mind firmly made up that he had changed and would never return to that life. He truly didn't have those feelings, though it felt strange because his devotion to this man ran so deep. Luke raised his voice then, asking one more time if Leo would truly consider coming back. Leo insisted he was fine, but Luke simply stared at him with a heavy gaze before finally turning to leave. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Leo felt a quiet, lingering sense of nostalgia for what they had. For a proud man like Luke to come here and practically guarantee his return was beyond anything Leo had imagined. He had said so much, and given Luke's pride, he expected the man to be completely indifferent, didn't he? A certain stillness settled over him, and deep down, he felt a strange sense of gratitude toward Luke. Ultimately, without that initial investment, Uncle Ben might have passed away and his dreams would have crumbled, but facts were facts. He didn't want to return to that house, to see the children laughing, or even to look at Joe's face again. If he hadn't become involved with Joe, perhaps his decision wouldn't be so firm, but his feelings were clear now. He felt the weight of it all until, after 11 that night, a sudden phone call startled him awake. It was Lynn. A sharp female voice on the other end called out, telling him to hurry down to the outdoor bar. Apparently, someone was drunk at the Royal Hotel. In an instant, Leo's sleepiness vanished, and he bolted upright. He checked his screen and saw it was a call regarding Joe, who happened to be Luke's best friend. He left immediately, not even caring if his hair was a mess, throwing on clothes and calling for a ride. When he arrived at the bar, we see the scene where he laid eyes on Luke for the first time that night. Luke was completely intoxicated, acting out with a flushed face and a dazed, reddened expression. Nearby, a woman named Joy had also been drinking heavily, restlessly touching her face as she sat there. She had the air of a delicate family woman, small and beautiful, possessing a very unique kind of charm. As Leo watched the scene, Lynn stepped forward and placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. She asked him why he had made Luke's sister so incredibly angry. Normally, she almost never drinks, yet here we see her drinking like there's no tomorrow. As she drank, she suddenly seemed to lose her balance, her stability wavering. Leo simply replied that this had absolutely nothing to do with him. He suggested that perhaps she and Joe were having a fight, which, honestly, wouldn't be surprising. He didn't believe for a second that her state was caused by his refusal to return home. And yet, she was clearly furious, something Luke hadn't shown in 8 long years. She had never shown him any real emotion before, not even a hint of anger. It seemed her joy, her sorrow, and her rage were always kept locked away inside. Lynn fell silent for a moment, lost in her own thoughts about the situation. She realized Leo was right. Luke had never truly looked this man in the eye before. How could she be this angry? And yet, the look in her eyes told a different story. Her suspicion finally softened, and she told Leo to just take her home already. She had just finished speaking when another thought suddenly crossed her mind. She reminded him that Joe had already returned, a fact he surely knew by now. She warned him not to take advantage of her vulnerability while she was this intoxicated. Otherwise, she suggested it might be better to just call Joe to take her home instead. Leo explained he had things to do tonight and couldn't simply walk away right now. But seeing Luke so drunk, he told Miss Zhao he couldn't just ignore her and leave. Leo suggested that if she didn't trust him, she could simply come along, as there were plenty of rooms at the house anyway. She could stay there for the night, an idea Miss Zhao considered while clearly feeling quite uneasy about the whole thing. She admitted that she truly didn't trust him, while Leo could only offer a somewhat pained smile in response. He approached Luke's sister and found he could lift her easily. She was tall, but light, weighing perhaps only 100 pounds. Since deciding to enter the entertainment industry, he had been hitting the gym daily to maintain a leading man physique. His muscles were toned and he felt full of strength, which, to be honest, was exactly what he needed right now. A little later, we see him locating her car in the parking lot to get her home safely. He managed to get her inside, knowing her home was located in the upscale district where Lin also lived. As they drove, Miss Zhao asked if his contract with Luke's sister was finally coming to an end. Sitting in the back seat, she pressed him for an answer with a sudden sense of urgency. The question caught him off guard, and he admitted there were still 2 months remaining on the agreement. She then asked what he was thinking now that Joe had finally returned to the picture. Leo told her he knew exactly what she was getting at, and revealed that he had already moved out. Miss Zhao was visibly shocked, unable to believe he had actually taken such a definitive step. She watched him closely as he explained that he was currently staying in a hotel for the time being. He planned to find a permanent apartment soon, a revelation that left her completely astonished. She asked if he was truly willing to let go, noting that Luke's sister had never treated him particularly well. Even though they were legally married and held a marriage certificate, the relationship had always been one-sided. She wondered if he was really okay with just walking away and letting her go like that. Leo simply smiled and asked her why on earth he wouldn't be willing to do exactly that. He calmly explained that those things didn't belong to him and that Sarah had actually taken very good care of him. Without that money, he admitted, he wouldn't have known how to survive or where he would be today. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, believing that since she had been so good to him, he shouldn't leave her in a difficult spot. A little later, Miss Zhao finally relaxed, telling him that perhaps it was for the best that he thought that way. She warned him not to overthink things, or he might end up being the one who suffers the most in the end. We returned to the house, where Leo carried Sarah to her bedroom and gently settled her in so she could sleep. He then went to the bathroom to fetch a basin of water and a cloth, carefully washing her face for her. After that, he hurried to the kitchen to prepare a warm soup to help her recover from the night's events. As he fed her, Miss Zhao stood to the side, watching him with a look of pure astonishment. She asked if he always took care of Sarah like this, to which he could only offer a small smile. He reminded her that Sarah was his employer and had paid him $50,000. After all, since he couldn't pay her back in cash, he felt the least he could do was these small, kind gestures. He wanted to do what was necessary, so he wouldn't have to worry about any serious issues once he finally went home. Miss Zhao kept her eyes fixed on him, but in that moment, Sarah's expression suddenly shifted. Without any warning whatsoever, she began to grow pale and looked as though she was about to be sick. He had no time to move out of the way before she ended up getting sick right all over him. Even when it comes from a beautiful woman, such a moment is, to be honest, quite hard to handle. In an instant, the entire room was filled with a rather overwhelming and unpleasant scent. Miss Zhao stood nearby, looking quite flustered and breaking into a bit of a cold sweat herself. She cried out for him to get away quickly, and he obliged, having done all he could now that the others had arrived. It was already past midnight, and he had no idea how he had managed to fall asleep so quickly. The next morning, Luke woke up early and prepared breakfast while Sarah and Miss Zhao finished getting ready. They eventually emerged from their rooms just as he was finishing up in the kitchen. We see them heading to the table as he began setting out the breakfast he had prepared. The meal looked incredible, prompting Sarah to ask if he had really made all of this himself. The delicious aroma could be smelled from across the room, enough to make anyone's mouth water immediately. She was genuinely surprised by his talent, her eyes fixed on the spread laid out in the kitchen. He asked if she was joking, insisting it was just a few simple dishes and nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah looked at the table filled with a hearty breakfast, her expression becoming quite complex and thoughtful. In recent years, he had often changed his recipes just to ensure his uncle had a variety of meals. Previously, she would just sit and eat without really feeling or noticing the effort behind the food. Now she realized that even if she hired a 5-star chef, things might feel quite different. She felt she might not be lucky enough to eat such a delicious meal every single day. It was simply too tasty, leading her to ask if he had been a professional chef in the past. Miss Zhao sat down, took a sip of the sesame porridge, and gave him a look of pure impressed wonder. He noticed her staring, her eyes crinkling into little half-moons as she enjoyed the food. He explained that while he wasn't a professional, he had spent a great deal of time cooking in the past. 3 years ago, he had spent a lot of time in the kitchen while caring for his Uncle Ben. He had plenty of time back then, which he used to study and perfect his cooking techniques. Hearing this, Sarah couldn't help but look up at him, her curiosity clearly piqued by his story. We see Sarah looking at him, realizing she had been entirely wrong about his past. She saw him only as a simple man, having no idea what he had truly endured. For the past few years, Luke had spent almost every moment at home. She spoke of going home, assuming that everyone had a family to return to. She didn't want to admit her mistake, leaving Sarah feeling quite conflicted and confused. At this point, she didn't even seem to care about the contract or their marriage. He admitted that for many years, he hadn't even understood his own basic situation. It was actually a kind teacher who found him in a kitchen, rescued him from the streets, and raised him. When he was 5, a family had finally taken him in to adopt him. But by the time he turned 10, they had a biological child of their own. They sent him back, he explained calmly, while continuing to eat his breakfast. He spoke as if he were discussing something completely trivial and unimportant. Sarah apologized, truly unaware that his origins were marked by such sadness. Miss Zhao's eyes filled with a mixture of deep sorrow and sincere apology. He told them it didn't matter anymore, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and stood up to address Sarah. He told Miss Zhao to enjoy her meal calmly, as he needed to head out first. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but in front of Miss Zhao, her usual composure prevented her from saying anything defensive. She could only watch him leave, while Miss Zhao turned to her and asked why she was questioning the contract. She asked if Sarah really intended to end the agreement, wondering why she wouldn't just let him go. The idea of letting him go left Miss Zhao looking at her in complete surprise. Jane spoke up, saying that as she knew, her father was intent on marrying that young teacher. She considered the man a mere plaything, someone who seemed to find a new partner every 3 days. Watching him filled her with resentment, and she admitted she wanted to follow Sarah's example. Her plan was simple: find a marriage certificate and a partner who could play the part. She believed that once her father saw she was settled, he would finally stop trying to control her life. Jane felt Luke was a perfect fit, while Sarah suddenly felt her heart sink and her throat go dry. Jane asked if Sarah really wanted to leave him, noting that Sarah already had her own life with Mark. Sarah opened her mouth to explain the situation, but then decided that perhaps an explanation wasn't necessary. She told Jane that Luke simply wasn't a suitable choice for her, though she struggled to say why. Jane wondered if it wasn't just a marriage of convenience, asking if she was actually expected to love him. She only intended to use him as a consultant, a statement that left Jane looking quite surprised. Sarah remained silent for a few long seconds, weighing the heavy truth she was about to share. Finally, she revealed that the woman was ill, suffering from terminal spinal cancer in its final stages. She likely had less than 2 months to live, a revelation that made Jane gasp and close her eyes in shock. It seemed impossible, and it was the primary reason why they were simply not a good match. Besides, her father was observant. Even if she weren't ill, he would never believe the ruse if she brought him home. Jane was stunned, and despite herself, she couldn't stop thinking about Luke's gentle nature and bright smile. It seemed that since the day she first met Luke, he had occupied a small corner of her heart. Luke had always been that way, steady and refreshing, like a gentle breeze in the springtime. In the past, she had rarely shown him any appreciation, often greeting him with a cold face or no words at all. But no matter how cold she was, her attitude never seemed to bother him much. Luke would always greet her with a warm smile, respectfully calling her Miss Zhao. She wasn't sure if it was because of his kind nature or something else entirely. But in that moment, she felt a sudden, heavy weight pressing down on her heart. She even found her breakfast quite tasteless as she sat there, feeling utterly bored and restless. Meanwhile, at the hospital, we find Sarah gently massaging her uncle's frail body. His long period of bed rest had led to a severe weakening of his physical strength. To help him, he needed these therapeutic massages every 2 or 3 days. The nursing staff didn't always have the strength to spare, so she came by every other day. After the massage, Uncle Ben always seemed to fall into a much more comfortable sleep. Sarah then took a cup and headed toward the hot water station for some tea. On her way down the hall, she noticed 2 family members walking toward her. Luke was there, thanking a woman for taking the time to come to the hospital. She told him it was no trouble at all and asked how he was feeling. He assured her he felt great, perfectly fine, in fact, given the circumstances. Since it was already noon, she insisted on taking him to lunch, refusing to take no for an answer. She joked that she'd feel terrible otherwise, having taken up his entire day like this. Sarah didn't stop, but the 2 of them looked up and they all found themselves face to face. Luke looked quite surprised to see her, while his companion, Jane, let out a happy exclamation. Without stopping to chat, Sarah simply gave Luke a small, polite nod of apology as she passed. She continued toward the hot water station, her mind briefly lingering on Rose before she moved on. "Has something happened, Director Liu?" she asked in a soft, quiet voice. "How are you?" "Thank you for your concern, Director Liu," he replied politely. Rose told him she was feeling better now, adding that he should call her if he ever needed money. He felt truly grateful for the offer, and she simply told him to come by again sometime. This caught him off guard. Come by again? He felt a flicker of genuine surprise at the suggestion. Conditions outside weren't nearly as good as in the city, and he certainly didn't have millions to his name. She insisted he shouldn't refuse her help, so he just waited in a moment of quiet silence. He couldn't help but think she was involving herself in something that wouldn't end well. To be honest, he no longer understood her feelings at all, especially since Lynn's boyfriend had returned. And yet, she continued to suggest that he should come and live in her village. After 10 seconds of confusion, he finally told her that there was no need for him to return. After all, doing so would only cause unnecessary problems for her and her boyfriend. He knew she wanted to say more, but he couldn't let things lose their sense of perspective. Despite everything, he thanked her for her generosity, though she clarified that the man wasn't hers. "Rose, what exactly are you saying?" Jane asked, giving him a knowing smile. Rose swallowed her words as Jane announced that she and Rose were heading out for a meal. They wouldn't be eating with him this time, a small, subtle smile playing on Jane's lips. In the end, it seemed Rose had cleared her busy, oppressive schedule just for this. Since she had gone out of her way to bring him to the hospital, she needed to grab a bite. He felt he should express his gratitude, asking Jane if she had a moment to spare. or perhaps she wanted them to go together. He certainly didn't want to become a nuisance. As it happened, he had things to attend to, so he picked up the bags and continued on his way. Rose watched his retreating back, a sweet, lingering sensation warming her heart. Jane then turned to her, suggesting they head to a restaurant she knew quite well. The food there was excellent, and she was eager for them to give it a try. Rose apologized to the man, Jack, explaining she had an urgent matter to handle at work. She promised they would do it next time, a polite deflection, as we often see in these situations. Jack accepted this, telling her to go ahead and that they could find time in the future. Luke took his leave of the director, making a mental note to invite him out another time. Rose didn't say much more before she turned and made her way back into the hospital. Upon her return, her cheerful expression shifted as she looked toward the direction where Luke had departed. We returned to the hospital office, where Luke found himself face-to-face with Rose once again. She told the young man to sit down, noting how his tired appearance made him look almost vulnerable. He asked nervously if something was wrong with his grandfather, his voice tight with worry. She told him there was no need to worry just yet, urging him to listen to what she had to say. He sat there as she tried to comfort him, remembering how he hadn't been entirely honest with her before. However, she believed a patient's family had every right to know the truth without anything being hidden. As she spoke these words, Rose placed a medical certificate directly on the desk in front of him. His grandfather's condition was poor. His history as a burn victim had left his spine in a fragile state. During that fire 3 years ago, he inhaled a great deal of heat, which caused even more severe damage to his spine. He has already reached the final stage of spinal decay, and as his guardian, you should know he likely has only 2 months to live. The news hit Luke like a bolt from the blue. How could this possibly be happening? Rose explained that while his grandfather, Mr. Miller, was being treated at the hospital, they had performed a comprehensive medical examination. At first, they found no signs of the illness, as the primary focus of the previous medical team had been elsewhere. They were focusing entirely on his status as a burn victim, weren't they? He questioned Rose, realizing with a heavy heart that while his previous doctor was a burn specialist, he wasn't a general practitioner. He was simply an internal specialist, which, to be honest, explains why this was overlooked for so long. The old man had spent a significant amount of time under the care of that hospital. It is likely they only performed a full physical checkup when he was first admitted. For the rest of his stay, their attention remained fixed solely on his burn recovery. Dr. Rose continued, explaining that in the early stages, these conditions are often quite hidden. When they begin as something small, it is true that they can be nearly impossible to detect. Over these 3 years, due to a lack of preventative care, the condition began to worsen significantly. Luke felt he was the one to blame, believing he had failed his grandfather by letting the illness progress to this point. For a moment, he couldn't even look her in the eye, and though Rose felt his deep sadness, she noticed a small change in his expression. She assured him it wasn't his fault, as the doctors were only focused on the specific task of treating the burns. Luke blamed himself, remembering how his grandfather often vomited while staying at the hospital. He had simply assumed the old man was in high spirits, and that these were just minor issues. He felt he had failed him. Looking into his eyes, Rose knew exactly how terrible he was feeling in that moment. And yet, despite his own crushing guilt, Luke was still worrying about how Rose felt. We see that Dr. Rose was quite moved by his selflessness in such a dark moment. In truth, she had planned to keep the full extent of the situation hidden from him for a while. Rose was, after all, the head of the medical center, meaning Luke was technically just one of her staff members. As it turns out, she had planned to invite several specialists to discuss whether a cure could be found. If a practical solution existed, she was determined to make this case a medical success. Deep down, she knew this could even be her path to becoming the vice president of the hospital. Unfortunately, after 3 days of consultation, the results remained the same. Saving him was impossible. And so, she had come specifically to tell him the truth today, so he could be mentally prepared. Looking at him now, she saw a handsome, well-educated young man. No wonder a woman like Rose wanted to help him. She told him that while there was no cure, they still had a little time before the end. Luke immediately asked if there was any way to extend his grandfather's life, which was his only priority. The doctor agreed it was possible, but warned him that it would require a great deal of money. Recently, a leading treatment from Europe had become available, though the price was staggeringly high. A single dose cost $2 million, and in his uncle's condition, he would need it for at least 2 or 3 months. If his body developed a resistance to the drug later on, the dosage and the cost would only increase. Without a second thought, Luke replied that he would find a way to get the money. After leaving the doctor at 6:30, he sat with his uncle, who had raised him for so many years. The old man had literally rescued him from a dumpster as a baby, back when Luke was a sick, crying infant. If it hadn't been for Mr. Miller, he likely would have died right there in the trash, forgotten by the world. When he was a child, his favorite thing was to sit by Mr. Miller's side, listening to stories about how life begins. The old man would always remember his birthday, giving him the gifts he wanted most while other children were left wanting. He would even offer stern critiques of Luke's grades if they weren't the absolute best. A true father figure, indeed. To Luke, this was his only real family in the entire world, the very anchor of his soul. Even with the memories of a past life as an emperor, he felt as though he had been raised by the old man twice. Now that his two souls had merged, he could feel the infinite pain of losing a loved one even more acutely. As he walked away, we see the tears finally begin to fall down his face. He picked up his phone and stared at the contact list, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. A look of helpless anger washed over his face as he contemplated his next move. He wondered if he should call, yet he knew he couldn't even bring himself to dial his mother's number. For many years, that stern female voice belonged to the woman who had once been his mother. From the age of 5 to 10, things had been good. For a while, they truly treated him like their own son. But when he was 8, his adoptive father, Mr. Miller, received a medical diagnosis that changed everything. 10 months after that diagnosis, the couple unexpectedly gave birth to a healthy, chubby baby boy. While the Millers were overjoyed by the miracle, this was where Luke's personal tragedy truly began. Once they had a biological son of their own, their affection for Luke vanished almost overnight. By the time he was 9, he was forced to take on all the heavy housework alone. If they were unhappy, they would take it out on him, which happened quite often, to be honest. A year later, they simply sent him back to the hospital, washing their hands of him entirely. He thought it would end there, but 3 years ago, they heard a rumor that he had married into a wealthy family. They would come to surprise him every couple of days, which, as we can imagine, made him quite unhappy. If they couldn't find him, they would head straight to the hospital and cause a massive scene there. He was genuinely shocked, realizing that they were fully prepared to drag him back to that hospital by force. They claimed that after all those years, they were entitled to compensation for everything they had done for him. So he gave them $2 million, and once they had the money, their volatile tempers finally settled down. But within a few years, they returned to their old tricks, complaining that their protection money wasn't enough. They were well aware that he was currently in the middle of filming a new movie. They even threatened to call the media, knowing he was terrified of how it might affect his reputation and his career. For 3 long years, he had been reflecting on this, yet all he got in return was this constant emotional instability. He didn't even need to think twice about why Sarah was calling him now. It was absolutely about asking for more money again, and as he wiped his face, we see the deep pain in his eyes. She reminded him that his younger brother was about to take his college entrance exams and could get into a great school. The problem, she claimed, was that the family didn't have a single cent left to their name. She demanded he hand over another $2 million immediately so his brother could actually attend university. Luke felt like weeping as he told her, "Sarah, I truly don't have any more money to give." She accused him of lying, refusing to believe him since he had married into a family worth hundreds of billions. To her, it seemed impossible that he wouldn't be willing to part with a mere $2 million. She screamed at him, asking if he even had a soul, claiming he would have starved to death without them. He tried to explain once more that his marriage was nothing more than a legal contract, a job, essentially. He was just an employee, and he asked her if she really thought a woman like that would ever truly love him. He explained that he was exhausted, and besides, his marriage contract with her was finally coming to an end. He truly had no money left now, especially since Uncle Charlie was still very, very ill. Deep down, he knew he still needed a vast amount of money just to save a life. He pleaded with Sarah, reminding her that he had already given them tens of thousands over the years. They had built a life and bought a luxury car. Couldn't they just leave him in peace now? Hearing this, Sarah scoffed, refusing to believe he wasn't lying about how the wealthy elite treat their young partners. She was certain that woman was taking care of him because of his looks, so his claims of poverty rang hollow. Who would ever believe such a story? And as for his peace and quiet, well, that was out of the question. She told him that if he just gave her more, she promised he would never feel this pressure again. She demanded another 100,000. Hearing this, Luke felt a sharp, familiar pain in his chest. To her, his wife's fortune of 10 million was an endless well that he was simply refusing to tap. She warned him that 100,000 was nothing to people like them, and he wouldn't escape this debt. She threatened to haunt him until the end. If her family couldn't live well, she didn't want him living well either. Luke simply laughed, realizing there was nothing he could do to change her mind, no matter how hard he tried. She hung up, and we see Luke standing there, looking as though he were pleading for his very life. He had always known that Sarah was a deeply reckless and unpredictable woman. In the past, he had given her money simply because he feared she would ruin things with his wife, Chloe. But now, Uncle Charlie was still waiting for the funds that might save his life. With his contract ending, he had no intention of continuing to throw money into that bottomless pit. Now, his only goal was to earn money quickly to extend Uncle Charlie's life, no matter the cost. And so, we see him entering the Riverside bar. After the day's crushing events, Luke felt utterly defeated. At that moment, all he wanted was a single drink to help him forget his troubles. The Riverside Bar was a massive establishment, always bustling with a constant flow of customers. In his past life, he had been a singer here, spending nearly every single night on that stage. The place had thrived largely because the owner was an exceptionally capable manager. As he stepped inside, a beautiful woman in her 30s caught sight of him under the dim lights. She approached him with a familiar warmth, and despite his exhaustion, Luke managed a small smile. This woman was Rose, the manager of the bar, and someone who knew him well. Back when he worked there, she had always gone out of her way to look after him. He mentioned he was there to earn some money, but she assumed he had finally come to see his sister. Rose rolled her eyes in mock disappointment, clearly unimpressed by his sudden reappearance. She could see he was in a foul mood, noting that he looked incredibly unhappy. She teased him about being with a wealthy woman now and neglecting his old friends. In a voice tinged with sadness, she reminded him that he hadn't returned even once in 3 years. He didn't know how to explain himself, especially when she asked if he knew how hard things had been for Lily. Rose explained that even after he left a month into his new life, she had stayed by Lily's side. 2 years ago, the girl had entered a talent show and actually made it into the top 10. Now she was signed to an agency. She wasn't a superstar yet, but she was finally getting some exposure. It was certainly a step up from being a simple lounge singer in a crowded bar. Luke was genuinely amazed, knowing deep down that singing had always been her greatest dream. Deep down, Luke couldn't help but want happiness for her, especially since she was such a good friend. Rose paused for a moment, looking him over before asking how he was really doing these days. She couldn't resist asking if things were still going well between him and that beautiful, wealthy woman. He didn't want to say too much, simply telling Rose that some things are just the way they are. Seeing the bar filling up, he told her he didn't want to keep her from her work any longer. He gestured toward a quiet corner and made his way over to find a place to sit. After sitting down, he ordered 2 sodas and quickly finished the first one to quench his thirst. A little later, Rose managed to slip away from her duties to join him for a quick drink. However, just as he was starting to feel a bit of heartache, he suddenly heard a startling voice. Right there beside him, a voice demanded to know what he was doing, breaking his melancholy thoughts. He turned around to see who it was, and to his absolute shock, he found himself looking at Sarah. Usually, he was used to seeing her in strict, professional white attire that commanded respect. But tonight, she wore a formal black dress that was strikingly elegant, her expression intense and almost overwhelming. We see that he wasn't the only one noticing. Many heated glances from the crowd were fixed on her. They were all staring at her, but Luke wasn't in the mood for company. He just wanted his drink. He certainly hadn't expected her to be here, yet Sarah sat down before him and silently ordered an orange liqueur. He could tell she was unhappy, so he tried his best to offer her some comfort. He assured her that the situation with the older man really wasn't her fault at all. He told her there was no need to feel guilty, as seeing her like that only made him feel worse. Then he turned the question back to her, asking why she was drinking and what was making her so miserable. She looked at him, wondering if it was because of the situation with the old man, remembering how much she claimed to hate drinking. Back when she was a singer here, she had to drink with the customers just to make ends meet, a common struggle, to be sure. She had done it so often that she grew to despise the very sensation of being intoxicated. And yet, here she was today, doing the one thing she hated most in the world. She was clearly miserable, and we see that she had already had quite a lot to drink. Her hair was a mess and her face was flushed red, showing just how far gone she really was. Hearing her words, Luke could only offer a sad smile, admitting that he felt like an absolute failure himself. Sarah paused for a moment, stood up to take another drink, her eyes clouded with a deep, dark sadness. She began to explain that her grandfather had essentially saved her life. Without him, she wouldn't even exist. To be honest, she had been a weak child, and her grades in school were never anything to brag about. Children like her, especially those in foster care, were often held back, but her grandfather never gave up on her. Later, when she discovered a talent for music, he did everything in his power to support her studies. Studying the arts is a luxury few ordinary families can afford, yet her grandfather worked tirelessly to support her dreams. Even at his advanced age, he took grueling jobs at construction sites, sometimes working at dangerous heights just to pay her tuition. As she spoke, the tears began to flow uncontrollably. She was clearly reaching her breaking point. It was agonizing for her to watch him suffer at the end of his life, feeling utterly helpless to save him. Luke watched Sarah break down in tears, and seeing her in such pain made his own heart ache for her. He tried to comfort her, insisting that her grandfather wouldn't blame her and that she had already done so much. Besides, he reminded her with a gentle tone, hadn't she said that he was her only true friend? He promised her right then that he would help her through this, and Sarah could only offer a whispered thank you. He spoke with firm conviction, telling her that she had helped him so much over these 3 years that he had no idea how to repay her. Sarah offered a faint smile, noting that he had handled her resistance quite easily that day. She asked him, with a touch of irony, if he didn't feel like he owed her for saving his life all this time. Besides, she added, as a doctor it was simply her duty to look after her patients. Luke's tolerance for alcohol was quite poor. After just 1 glass, his head was spinning and he could barely stand up. Sarah helped him into a car, calling for a driver to take him back toward the hospital where Dr. Chen worked. She didn't realize, of course, that he had already moved out of his old dormitory. Since she had brought him here once before, she still remembered the location of his old place. However, she couldn't take him all the way herself, so she used his phone to call his wife, Rose. We see her dial the number, reaching out to Rose to handle the situation. A cold, distant voice soon echoed from the other end of the line. Sarah asked if she was speaking with Mrs. Miller, explaining that Luke was currently very drunk. She requested that Rose come to meet them at the entrance of the dormitory. Rose demanded to know who was calling, surprised to hear a woman's voice on her husband's phone. Sarah simply replied that she was a friend of his, keeping her tone professional. Rose hesitated for a few seconds, processing the request before finally agreeing to come. 10 minutes later, Rose arrived at the gate, dressed in casual clothes and looking quite hurried. Her car came to a halt when she spotted Sarah standing there by the entrance. She was momentarily stunned. To be perfectly honest, she hadn't expected this woman to be so beautiful. Sarah was just as tall as she was and carried herself with a refined, elegant air that Rose found quite striking. When she encountered such a beautiful friend of his, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of discomfort. Taking 2 steps forward, Rose demanded to know why Sarah had taken him out drinking in the first place. She asked if Sarah was unaware of his poor health, her voice sounding harsh and unpleasant to Sarah's ears. Sarah wondered if this was the same cold attitude Luke had to endure every single day. Thinking of this, and seeing the look in Rose's eyes, Sarah found herself becoming quite angry. Why would anyone treat a man as kind and good as Luke with such blatant disrespect? She addressed Rose, noting that while she knew her family was wealthy, she expected a bit more courtesy in her tone. Sarah's firm reply caught Rose completely off guard, leaving her momentarily stunned. Deep down, Rose realized her tone hadn't been quite right, though she wasn't used to being corrected. To be honest, she didn't usually treat people this way. Today, she was simply worried about Luke's health. He only had 2 months left to live, and here this woman was, letting him drink his life away. The fact that he had clearly had far too much to drink only fueled her growing frustration. Rose reached for him, but Sarah narrowed her eyes, stating that as Luke's friend, she had something to say. She noted that while Luke might lack money or status and didn't fit into Rose's social circle, he was a truly wonderful person who deserved to be appreciated and loved for who he was. Sarah hoped Rose could show some kindness, warning that if she didn't appreciate him, many others gladly would. We see that Sarah could guess Rose didn't truly know her, or the weight her words carried. Otherwise, she would have known she was speaking to a woman worth $100 trillion. A woman whose husband wouldn't be so stressed, as she could easily pay off any debt to ease his suffering. She concluded by saying that neither she nor Luke needed anyone's confusion or judgment, and that was that. Despite the tension, Rose managed to offer a brief word of thanks to Sarah for bringing him back safely. We see Rose watching intently as Sarah helps Luke out of the car, while he remains lost in a deep, drunken sleep. Once they were back inside the house, she helped him settle onto the bed so he could rest. She stood there for a long time, simply waiting for her own emotions to cool down. She looked at Luke, studying the man she had spent so much time with over the years, yet perhaps never truly knew. Even while drunk, he was remarkably quiet, no shouting or nonsensical rambling, just the stillness of a deep slumber. On the surface, one had to admit this man appeared quite perfect. Rose had seen many handsome men in her life, but Luke easily ranked among the top 3 she had ever met. After watching him in silence for a minute, she went to the bathroom and returned with a warm cloth to wash his face. She then pulled his covers up. At that moment, Luke was still asleep, completely unaware of Rose's gentle care. Entering her study, Rose immediately placed a call to her family physician, a man known as Dr. John. The doctor asked if there was a problem and inquired specifically about Luke's current condition. The news wasn't good. The doctor explained that the situation was becoming increasingly grave with each passing day. He mentioned that he had been consulting with a group of specialists over the last few days regarding the case. Dr. John suggested that the best course of action now was to procure a specialized medication from Europe. The cost was staggering, $2 million per bottle, with a requirement of 3 bottles every month. To a woman of Rose's means, however, such a sum meant very little in the grand scheme of things. Without a second thought for the expense, she simply asked how long he would need to remain on this treatment. The doctor warned that while the drug was effective, the body would eventually build up a strong resistance to it. Its peak effectiveness, he noted, would only last for the first 2 months, which, as we know, was all the time he had. After that, the dosage would have to be increased gradually until it lost all effectiveness, Dr. John explained. In his professional opinion, this medication could potentially sustain him for more than 6 months. Rose paused for a moment. Money was no object if it meant giving him more time. The doctor promised to do everything in his power, asking Rose to remain calm while he handled the arrangements. She eventually hung up the phone, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her as she returned to the room to look at Luke. A few minutes later, she made another call, this time regarding the items left behind in hotel room 308. She gave instructions for everything to be packed up and delivered directly to her home. An hour later, her assistant Susan called, having retrieved the car that had been left at the hotel. Susan was quite confused, wondering why Rose had chosen to leave the scene on her own. Rose cut the conversation short, leaving Susan in a stunned silence that could only be cured by a stiff drink. Susan eventually spoke up, noting that Rose and her old flame, Mark, were finally in a position to be together after all these years. She warned that if Rose remained entangled with Luke, Mark certainly wouldn't be happy about it. Rose looked at her coldly, wondering aloud when Susan had become so talkative and opinionated about her private life. She asked if Susan really thought she needed to be taught how to handle her affairs before telling her to leave. After Susan left, Rose stood alone in the quiet room for a long time, lost in thought. Usually, she enjoyed the complexities of Western literature, finding herself drawn to the intricate emotions of the heroines. We learned that back in their university days, Mark had been incredibly popular with everyone. At the time, Mark was the star of the campus, handsome, from a good family, talented, and admired by all. Even Rose had felt her heart flutter, and unable to resist his persistent pursuit, she had finally accepted him. Yet, while they walked the same path, there was never any physical intimacy, only a connection of the spirit. She told herself that if the day ever came when she felt they were truly right for each other, she would give him everything. Back then, Mark had agreed to her terms, but after graduating, he found he could no longer endure a love that was only for show. He eventually grew harsh, insisting they go to a hotel to finally break the barriers between them. After Mark left the country for a fresh start, Rose began to reflect on whether she had simply been too demanding. After all, in today's world, who stays in a long-term relationship without ever letting their partner get close? The more she dwelled on this, the more guilt she felt, and her lingering feelings for Mark only seemed to grow. Deep down, she had intended to wait for Mark to return to her. She planned to give him her all if they were still in love, but when she saw him at the airport, something had changed. To be honest, she didn't feel the rush of joy she had imagined she would. Rose was naturally reserved, and in her relationship with Mark, they hadn't actually spent much time physically together. Because Mark was often away filming, she had been quite slow to process her emotions, and even now, things remained unclear. She wondered what her feelings for Mark really were. Was it still love, or just a lingering shadow of a past obsession? As she was lost in these thoughts, she was suddenly startled by a sound coming from the bedroom. Feeling a bit anxious, she stepped inside to see what was happening. We see that Luke, who had been sound asleep, was finally starting to stir. He looked up at her, confused, and asked the old man, referring to himself, what Rose was doing there. He spoke with great difficulty, but Rose simply replied that since this was her home, there was nowhere else for her to be. Luke realized his mistake and apologized, his voice weak as he remembered where he was. He told her he would leave immediately, struggling to get out of bed to make his exit. Rose told him to sit back down, her tone shifting as she pointed out it was already noon, and asked where he thought he was going. She informed him that she had already brought his belongings back to the house. She had even cleared out his old room, declaring that from now on, he would be living right here. Luke looked at her in disbelief, reminding her that their contract hadn't actually reached its end yet. Rose wasn't having it, insisting that he couldn't go anywhere, at least not for the next month. Her voice was firm as she told him he would stay put, almost daring him to try and leave. She repeated it with such intensity that it was clear she wasn't giving him any other choice. We can only imagine the confusion Luke felt, watching this beautiful woman suddenly flare up with such unexpected anger. He asked her why she was doing this, but Rose seemed too caught up in her own grief to answer. He felt as small as a kitten, wondering if she felt entitled to treat him this way just because of the money she'd spent. He told Rose that there was no need for her to be so aggressive with him. He had his own sense of dignity, after all, and couldn't understand why she was bullying him like this. He raised his voice, reminding her that he had already promised to pay back every cent of the $140,000. He asked what more she wanted, wondering if he was being kept there just to serve her romantic whims. He told Rose she was being ridiculous, questioning what kind of love this was supposed to be. He wanted to leave, but she was forcing him to stay just to watch her play house with her young master. Was he supposed to just sit there and watch them prove their love? Yes, he had taken her money. But he didn't believe that gave her the right to lash out at him this way, and honestly, who could blame him? He didn't have some twisted desire to deceive people or play these games. He demanded to know why she wanted him to stay. Was it just so he could suffer? He told her to wake up and let him go, because he had no interest in being a third wheel in her drama. As we return to Luke, a deep sense of doubt begins to cloud his mind. He lay back on the bed, drifting into sleep while seemingly crying out in his dreams. He felt as though he were being treated like a stray, while Rose simply stood there, watching him in silence for a long moment. Seeing him so quiet and defeated, she suddenly broke into a fit of laughter that just wouldn't stop. Quite unexpectedly, the heavy tension in the room was replaced by a strange, flickering sense of joy. The next morning, Luke sat up in bed rubbing his aching head, looking around the house as if he were a complete stranger. He sat there for a while until it hit him. During the night, he had said things to her that he probably should have kept to himself. He began to doubt his own judgment, scolding himself for drinking when he knew he shouldn't have. He had kept drinking anyway, and now he had to wonder how on earth he was going to fix this mess. A heavy, sinking feeling settled deep in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. Now that those words were out in the open, he had no idea how he was supposed to face her. After sitting on the bed for a moment, he went to wash up, but the moment he stepped out, he was completely overwhelmed by what he saw. There in the kitchen was Rose, dressed in a simple green outfit that caught him completely off guard. She was busy at work, the fabric of her clothes tracing the lines of her silhouette as she moved. Even in such a domestic setting, she couldn't hide the striking presence she always carried with her. Luke blinked, staring in disbelief and wondering if he was actually seeing what he thought he was seeing. In all the years he had known Rose, he had never once seen her set foot in a kitchen. He could only sit there and watch. After all, she was a wealthy woman, a powerful CEO worth millions. She was someone who never had to lift a finger, usually busy managing contracts worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Seeing her look so out of place among the pots and pans reminded him that, usually, he was the only one who ever worked in this kitchen. He felt a strange guilt, as if he were responsible for letting someone like Rose get her hands dirty with such mundane chores. And now, quite suddenly, we see her standing in the kitchen, actually preparing a meal. She wore a small hat and had prepared a bowl of rice, a sight that filled Luke's heart with an unexpected warmth. For a moment, one might have guessed that someone had cast a magic spell over her. However, we must admit that Rose looked remarkably serious as she focused on her cooking. Her expression lacked its usual icy chill. Her features seemed softer, and a faint, gentle smile played upon her lips. The morning light seemed to glow around her, confirming that she was, in fact, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Rose seemed to hear a sound from outside, and turned to find Luke standing there, looking rather foolish and wide-eyed with surprise. As she turned her head fully toward him, that faint, knowing smile remained on her face. She asked if he was awake, and he confirmed he was, though deep down he felt a wave of genuine embarrassment. When he asked if she was preparing food, she told him it would be ready in just a moment and to wait. He instinctively tried to back away, but his legs felt heavy and frozen. Instead of leaving, he found himself asking a rather silly question. He asked if she needed his help, but she simply told him no, that everything was nearly ready. Soon, he was sitting at the table, staring with a startled expression as Rose personally served him a bowl of soup. The taste was quite ordinary, which was to be expected, really, given that Rose was a complete novice in the kitchen. The soup had clearly been sitting in the pot a bit too long, so the flavor wasn't exactly perfect, but he found himself enjoying it anyway. He told himself that a soup made personally by a woman of her stature wasn't something just anyone got to experience. In his eyes, this simple bowl of soup seemed more delicious than the finest gourmet meal. As he drank, he found it nearly impossible to look away from her. He looked at Rose's beautiful face, realizing that the time had come for them to finally discuss everything. He knew he should explain things once and for all, yet he still couldn't bring himself to break his gaze. He gazed at Rose's beautiful face, feeling as though the time had finally come for them to discuss everything. Deep down, he knew he needed to explain the situation to Director Rose once and for all. He mentioned he would be leaving after breakfast. Rose didn't look up, simply sipping her juice before setting it down. She seemed preoccupied, perhaps feeling a bit off, as she silently reviewed financial reports on her phone. He continued, explaining that he had found some work in television and was planning to rent his own place. Hearing this, Rose suddenly looked up and asked quite calmly if she had treated him poorly during these last 3 years. The question caught him off guard, and he struggled to find the right words to say. His mind raced through their history together, searching for a way to explain his decision without causing more pain. To be perfectly honest, he remained silent for a long moment, simply not knowing how to answer her. Rose then asked if his departure was because of Jake, leaving Luke completely speechless. He looked at her intently, realizing that she was waiting for a real answer this time. He reminded her that her vice president, Susan, had told him the contract was originally meant to spite her ex-boyfriend. Now that the man was back, he felt the contract was no longer necessary and staying would only cause awkwardness. He asked for her thoughts, assuring her that he wasn't trying to leave her empty-handed or take advantage. He even offered to return the initial $140,000 he had been paid. Rose let out a sharp, frustrated breath but said nothing. He took a deep breath, assuming she understood. It seemed the matter was settled, and that from now on, they would go their separate ways, which was for the best. Feeling a sense of relief, he went to the kitchen to wash the dishes before heading to his room. But as he began to pack his things to leave, Rose's cold, steady voice drifted in from behind him. She warned him not to dare leave, reminding him quite sharply that she was a businesswoman and she had paid for his time. She told him he must endure his obligations and face the consequences until their time was officially up. We see him finally leaving the house, bag in hand, his expression heavy with things he desperately wanted to say. He felt she truly needed to visit a hospital for an evaluation, as her behavior seemed like a sickness of its own. It seemed she only needed to exert her power over him, leaving him feeling completely drained and cast aside. He sat there, trying to catch his breath and regain his composure, attempting to forget the time he had lost. With only 1 month left to live, he gritted his teeth and decided he would no longer worry about things he couldn't change. The most important thing now, of course, was finding a way to earn some serious money. His benefactor, Uncle Charlie, required 3 types of medication every single month, totaling $600,000. That amount was a staggering sum for him to consider, especially given his current circumstances. Unsure of how Rose's sister was doing, he prepared himself to reach out to Rose's family. When he asked, it became clear that the family had no intention of letting Rose return home just yet. He suddenly remembered that when the family called for him, it was always for a specific purpose of their own. The message was urgent. Luke needed to get to Uncle Charlie's building immediately for an important job. He agreed to go right away, quickly changing into more formal clothes to make a professional impression. He headed out and took a car to the building, where he spotted Rose's sister just as he was stepping out. We see Rose's sister waiting at the entrance, dressed in a rather striking and unusual outfit. She hurried over to meet him, asking if he could believe how much the studio's vision had shifted. This new film was a massive production with a budget exceeding $20 billion, boasting an incredibly rich cast. Rose was set to be the lead actress, a role that connected her with many veteran figures in the industry. Even the national broadcasters had secured the distribution rights for this film a long time ago. A long time ago, the lead role in a production of this scale would have gone to a massive star. As for Rose's sister, she admitted she never had the courage to imagine herself in such a huge film. She figured if a blockbuster like this was too difficult, a smaller supporting role might still help her stand out. It was a chance to finally become famous, as all the major agencies were eager to represent her now. She explained that she had no other work, as she was currently busy caring for her mother in the hospital. Through sheer persistence, and perhaps a bit of luck, she had managed to secure a role with Pansy Entertainment. She had landed the job, though it was only for a single performance in the entire production. It was all in her hands now, whether she could make it or not, and she was genuinely thrilled. As it turned out, she was cast as the third female lead, a role she usually wouldn't get with her level of experience. She felt she rarely got the chance to perform, and the Lewis family had already helped her so much. Luke promised her he would do his absolute best, watching as she gave him a beautiful, appreciative smile. Deep down, he felt it was a pity that their time together was destined to be so short. The performance was scheduled for later, so he knew he had to hurry and finish reading the script. The specific scene he was responsible for was set to be filmed around 2:30 in the afternoon. With only 5 hours left to prepare, he didn't dare lose focus for even a single second. After that, he sat down and began to study the script with total concentration. While he was pouring his heart and soul into the lines, a surprised voice suddenly broke his focus. He looked up abruptly, his hair slightly disheveled, only to lock eyes with a woman named Zoe. He met her angry gaze, noticing how her eyes seemed to flash against the shimmer of her golden dress. A sudden wave of nerves washed over him, leaving him completely unable to find his words. We see him looking down at the script, wondering if he truly has what it takes to pull off this performance. As he held the pages in his hands, Zoe's eyes suddenly flashed with a sharp, unmistakable intensity. She looked at him with utter disbelief, as if she couldn't quite wrap her head around what she was seeing. He began to feel quite uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze, especially when her questioning voice broke the silence. Zoe's eyes narrowed as she accused him of being the type of person who says one thing and then does another. To her, he was nothing more than a master of surprises, though she certainly didn't mean it as a compliment. She asked if he remembered the words he had spoken so confidently back at the coffee shop that day. He had promised to be transparent, yet here he was, standing right in front of her again. It was only a few days ago, after all, that he had been treated like absolute trash and cast aside. His first reaction wasn't anger, but a strange sort of curiosity about how Zoe had found him so quickly. He assumed Rose must have told her, though he couldn't fathom what this woman was actually trying to achieve. Between her complicated love life and her constant demands, he was starting to find Rose's behavior rather exhausting. After all, if she was being paid to do a job, she should at least maintain some level of professional excellence. He spoke up weakly, suggesting that Zoe was mistaken to think he could return without Rose's explicit consent. Watching Zoe's foolish display, he asked why she didn't just take her grievances up with Rose directly. Zoe's expression turned sour as she snapped back, asking him who he thought he was to give her advice. She warned him that if he continued to work with Rose, she would ensure his career in the industry was over. Then, a cold smile spread across her face as she brought up his upcoming performance in the production. She revealed that Rose was the main investor, and only because Zoe herself wanted the second male lead role. She made it clear that with one word to Rose, his performance would be canceled before it even began. His words were cut short as Zoe struck a confident pose and left without waiting for an answer, leaving Luke sitting there in a state of utter confusion, wondering who this Rose woman really was. We moved to the audition hall, where an assistant entered the room, and Luke snapped back to his senses, knowing deep down that Zoe's threats were likely true. He realized that Rose could indeed remove him from the production at any moment, yet a small, desperate hope still flickered within him. The truth was, he was in desperate need of the money, and this particular role had become incredibly important to his future. Even if there was only a 1 in a million chance of success, he knew he had to try, so he followed the assistant into the audition room with a heavy heart. He followed the assistant through the doors, stepping into the space where his fate would soon be decided. Seeing the 3 professors sitting there as judges, he felt a sudden urge to give up, but he forced himself to stay composed. He offered a polite greeting to the professors, trying his best to hide the nerves that were beginning to take hold. One of them looked up and asked if he was Luke, before gesturing for him to take a seat and begin. Professor Dan gave him a generous smile and explained that he wanted to hear Luke's personal analysis of the character first. Luke took his seat, positioning himself carefully as he prepared to deliver the performance of his life. He began by explaining that he viewed the character of John as someone who was actually quite complex and layered. He described the character's personality as something that shifts through 3 distinct stages: the beginning, the middle, and the end. For the next 10 minutes, he spoke with a calm, deliberate pace, detailing every nuance of the role. He stopped at exactly the right moment, concluding that this was his honest interpretation of the character's dignity. Professor Lee's eyes lit up slightly, showing a clear sense of appreciation for the depth Luke had brought to the table. It seemed quite obvious to the judges that he had studied the role with an intensity that few others could match. The lead actor had many scenes with this specific character, and as a result, he was very protective of who would play the part. That was why he had made a special effort to attend the auditions in person today, watching every candidate closely. Before Luke arrived, more than a dozen people had already auditioned, including several very famous actors. But when it came to understanding the character of John, it was clear that no one else had even come close to his level of depth. He offered a humble nod, thanking Professor Lee for acknowledging his hard work and insight. Deep down, he felt almost guilty, knowing his secret was simply a sharp memory and an uncanny ability to inhabit a role quickly. We see that the true essence of this character lay in his ability to navigate the complexities of a metaphorical battlefield. Professor Lee looked at him and noted that for an actor like Luke, the true test of importance was the actual performance. He reminded him that while research is vital, the final decision always rests on how one chooses to bring that research to life. With a small, encouraging smile, Professor Lee announced that they would now move on to the acting portion of the audition. He asked Luke if he remembered the pivotal scene involving the secret girlfriend at the university. Luke responded instantly, confirming that he knew exactly which scene the professor was referring to. It was, after all, one of the most iconic moments in the entire script, a true test for any performer. He was to play the role of the third male lead, John, a character defined by his intense loyalty. John was a high-ranking military captain who had fallen for the protagonist at first sight. The object of his affection was a woman out of time, a traveler caught in a world that wasn't her own. His love for her was absolute, the kind of devotion that would lead a man to risk everything just to keep her safe. He had repeatedly defied military orders and moved entire divisions, causing a political collapse within the imperial court. This defiance had even led the elders of the empire to strike down the highest-ranking officials in their fury. There were many dramatic layers to this story, but in short, John was a character of immense status and even greater passion. He was a man willing to give the protagonist the world, yet he remained a tragic figure, destined to be a fleeting memory. No matter how much he loved her, he could never truly escape the rigid constraints of the world they lived in. In the end, the protagonist would choose the path of the empire, leaving John and his sacrifices behind. We see that the secret drama involving the university student's lover was the final scene of John's emotional explosion. During this time, he had pursued the protagonist. It was a final, subtle detail, and a difficult one to express. In the audition room, Luke and Professor Lee faced each other to begin the scene. He asked her if the Emperor of the Empire was the one forcing her into this. He told her plainly that he loved her. She replied that he had misunderstood everything, a painful blow, to be sure. In fact, she told him that she had always thought of him as nothing more than a brother. He refused to be just a brother, feeling as though he were losing his mind with grief. In a moment of desperation, he reached out and took Professor Lee's hand with great force. He called out her name, telling her he loved her and was willing to give her everything. He insisted the Emperor was the one deceiving her, promising to take her away to a far-off place. As he spoke these words, his eyes were filled with a desperate plea, and his body trembled slightly. She told him he was hurting her, addressing him once again as Brother John. She explained the Emperor hadn't tricked her. Marrying him was her own sincere wish. She thanked him for his love, but repeated that she truly only saw him as a brother. She confessed her love for the Emperor alone, knowing it hurt him, but wanting him to stop this madness. She ended by reiterating that, in the end, he would always be just a brother to her. Hearing this, he looked toward the sky like a man driven to the edge, his laughter ringing out. Tears began to fall immediately, his eyes clouding over with a thick veil of sorrow. He looked toward the observers, and within moments, everyone in the room was swept up in his raw emotion. Suddenly, the silence of the room was broken by the sharp, rhythmic sound of applause. Professor Lee quickly wiped away her tears, trying to hide how deeply the scene had affected her. She offered Luke a genuine smile, telling him he had done an incredible job. She admitted she could barely keep up with his pace, wondering if he truly had never held a major role before. Luke firmly explained that, until now, he had mostly played minor parts in small web dramas. Director Wu spoke up then, addressing him simply as a talented young man. He noted that Luke's emotional transitions were so natural they didn't even seem like acting, a rare gift indeed. The emotional depth he displayed was, in the director's eyes, nothing short of perfect. He was particularly impressed by the crying scene, which he described as truly outstanding. The third judge, Mr. Dan, joined in with a smile, encouraging the boy to keep working hard. He lamented that many young actors today are too soft, caring only about how much money they can make. They don't understand the craft, he noted, and relying on a pretty face alone leads to a very short career. But he saw something different in Luke, urging him to continue refining his impressive skills. He predicted that, in the future, Luke would certainly find his rightful place at the top of the industry. Deeply moved, Luke expressed his gratitude for the warmth and kindness shown by the three professors. Director Wu then told him to go prepare, for unless something unexpected happened, the role was already his. It was well known that Director Wu preferred to make decisions on the spot to avoid outside political influence. And it seems Luke's performance had completely won him over just moments ago. We see here a rare combination, top-tier looks paired with truly world-class acting ability. A young actor with such a solid foundation is a rare find, a star waiting to be born. He realized that all he truly needed was one person, someone who could believe in him and give him that final push. At this point, he didn't even care about becoming a massive star or a household name. Reflecting on his years of struggle, he knew that even if he became successful later, he would always cherish this moment of recognition. With a humble bow, Luke thanked Director Wu, along with Professor Dan and Professor Lee, for the opportunity. He had managed to channel his rawest emotions at exactly the right moment, and it had paid off. As he finally stepped out of the audition room, he found he could no longer suppress the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He had fought hard to keep a lid on his nerves, but now he could breathe. He had actually landed the role. The salary was only $30,000, but if he could use this work as a stepping stone, he might finally stop worrying about his future. Because he had feared he might never make it as an actor, this job meant everything to him. It wasn't just about the money. It was about honoring the memory of his late uncle, a lifelong actor named Leo. He was just about to share the good news with Professor Lee when a familiar voice called out from behind him. It was the famous actress, Sarah, who approached him with a smile, suggesting they exchange contact information on social media. She noted that there was still some time before the official filming would begin. In their free time, she suggested they could communicate more to better understand their characters and improve their performance. Luke felt a bit dazed. Sarah, a top-tier A-list star, was actually asking for his personal contact info. Feeling a bit flustered, he quickly pulled out his phone and added her, not wanting to keep such a big star waiting. He politely asked her to guide him and give him plenty of advice in the future. Sarah looked at him and laughed, telling him not to be so formal since she wasn't that much older than him. Being called Professor made her feel far too old, so she insisted he just call her Sarah from now on. She mentioned she might need his help with something later and promised they would talk more over the app. Luke decided to keep things respectful, addressing her as Professor Lee once more. His face flushed a deep shade of red, though he told himself that calling her by her full name, Linda Lee, might actually be better. Linda let out a soft, amused chuckle before turning away to make her exit. Immediately afterward, we see Luke tracking down Professor Dan in the classroom to share the news. He explained that the director had officially offered him the job. Professor Dan was absolutely thrilled, though he was momentarily stunned that the director had spoken so highly of him. He told Luke that he knew all along the young man had the talent to pull it off. In a burst of genuine joy, the professor hugged him, certain that this role would finally make Luke a star. He even joked that, eventually, he might have to ride on Luke's coattails once he became famous. Luke's face turned bright red again. To be honest, the sudden physical affection made him feel a bit awkward. The professor realized his excitement had gotten the better of him and quickly let go. Noticing Luke's ears were burning with embarrassment, the older man laughed, teasing him for being so shy despite being a grown man. He insisted they celebrate the new job by heading out to a brand new spot in town. The professor chose a refined Western restaurant located right in the heart of the city. After they finished ordering their meal, he mentioned that filming was set to begin early next month. There were still 2 weeks left to prepare, and while he trusted Luke's skills, he knew there was no room for error. He warned that they couldn't afford to be careless and suggested using this time for some intensive training. The plan was for them to spend the coming days strictly refining Luke's acting techniques. Luke could hardly believe his ears, wondering if the professor was truly serious about such a rigorous schedule. As the professor began listing the many challenges ahead, Luke looked into his eyes and felt a sudden chill of intimidation. The professor asked if he was still calling her Professor Lee, or if they were only here to discuss acting techniques. That was simply how Linda was. He shouldn't be misled just because she was acting friendly in the moment. In reality, most people found her incredibly difficult to approach, let alone hold a conversation with. We learned that rumors had been swirling around Professor Lee for quite some time now. Word was that her family provided the major funding, and she was known for having a rather explosive temperament. One day, she had even publicly called out several politicians and investors who tried to take advantage of her. To put it simply, she was the leading lady on screen, but in real life, she was an absolute queen. It seemed unlikely that such a powerful woman with an elite background would want to discuss acting with a newcomer like Luke. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it, especially when she looked at him with such a complex expression. It appeared that Professor Lee, despite her reputation, hadn't shown this kind of interest in any other man before. Deep down, he realized that beneath the intimidating exterior, she was still a human being like anyone else. However, halfway through their meal, two people suddenly walked through the restaurant doors. They began walking toward our table, interrupting the quiet atmosphere of the dinner. The moment this pair entered the room, they immediately drew the attention of every patron in the place. It was Rose and her companion, and we see them heading toward the area near the entrance where Luke sat. A man named Justin was walking beside Rose, smiling broadly as he leaned in close to her. For some time now, he had been trying to invite Rose out for a private date. He had asked many times, but Rose always claimed she was busy and had no interest in dining with him. He thought he knew Rose well, assuming she was just a bit slow to catch on, so he kept believing his own lies. He had done so much to get her attention, yet she had never truly looked his way until now. There was a certain sense of unease between them, yet he was certain that, just like in college, he would do his best to pursue her. He believed that he could eventually win over this cold beauty, no matter how long it took. And so, he didn't rush things, making sure to send her morning and evening greetings every single day. He even arranged for flowers to be delivered and made sure Rose was invited to dinner at very specific, scheduled times. His focus was entirely on her, and he used every resource at his disposal to keep his presence constant in her life. He was relentless in his efforts, always making sure his settings and plans were perfectly arranged. Eventually, they found themselves right in front of the table where Luke and his companion were sitting. After they sat down, Rose happened to have her back to Luke, while her companion sat directly facing him. As we watch, the atmosphere seemed a bit dull until Rose suddenly flashed a truly stunning smile. She looked at him and told him that she was truly grateful for everything he had done. Justin explained that as an only son, he didn't actually have as much influence within his family as people might think. He admitted that his family's vast resources didn't always flow his way as easily as one would expect. He felt that without this specific project, things would have been incredibly difficult for his career. He insisted that getting this lead role was his own doing, and helping her was simply the right thing to do. We see that his department had evaluated the project and decided it was a venture well worth the investment. He then asked Rose if she remembered their time back in university, a time that seemed so long ago now. Back then, she had told him with absolute certainty that he would eventually become a superstar. Justin was deeply appreciative, knowing that if she hadn't used her family's influence to support him, he wouldn't be successful today. He recalled how 3 years ago, when he was overwhelmed by a personal storm, he had chosen to leave alongside her. He mentioned hearing from a friend that she had been quite upset, yet she had remained by his side through it all. To be perfectly honest, he admitted that he had missed her deeply over all these years. He confessed that the overwhelming emotions he felt back then had been almost impossible to bear. He never imagined that, after everything, she would still be willing to help him now. "Rose, you have always been so good to me," he said, causing her to pause for a few seconds. She told him not to worry, noting that his current success was something he had earned himself. From his nearby table, Luke found he had no desire to overhear them professing their feelings. Unfortunately, they were sitting so close that it was nearly impossible not to hear every word. He felt a wave of tension wash over him, his entire body stiffening as he listened. He realized that because he was right there, Rose felt comfortable speaking so freely. It seemed that only Justin had the privilege of enjoying this relaxed, intimate side of her. To Luke, Rose had always maintained a sophisticated and somewhat distant image. She was usually so serious. Perhaps that was simply the difference between a colleague and a lover. As their conversation drifted through the quiet room, Luke's gaze went blank and his meal lost all flavor. "By the way, Rose," Justin asked, "what was it you wanted to talk to me about?" He brought up the new girl, mentioning that she was just an inexperienced newcomer. He didn't believe she had the talent or the capability to handle such a significant role. He told Rose that since she did this for him, he couldn't let some nobody ruin the project. "I have already spoken to the director about it," Rose replied, her voice sounding cold and firm. Hearing this, Luke's eyes fixed forward as a slight tremor ran through his entire body. "Luke, what's wrong?" his companion asked, sensing that something had suddenly changed. She wore an expression of deep exhaustion, so Luke stood up and told Mrs. Lewis that he felt quite unwell. He suggested they leave immediately, asking her if they could go right that second. Mrs. Lewis was visibly startled by his state, as he truly did look quite distressed. She rose from her seat at once, preparing to lead him out of the restaurant. Suddenly, Justin called out to him, mistakenly thinking Luke was just there for a visit. At the sound of those words, Rose turned around and saw Mrs. Lewis and Luke just as they were about to depart. Her gaze lingered on Luke's face for a few seconds before shifting toward Mrs. Lewis. Even though Mrs. Lewis was over 30, she had a natural grace and was an expert at presenting herself. With her elegant makeup, she looked truly beautiful and quite striking in that moment. She possessed a certain charm that naturally drew people in and made them feel at ease. Luke had worked with Mrs. Lewis for a year, and she had accompanied him home many times. And yet, we see that she and Rose had never actually met face-to-face before. Under normal circumstances, he had never even mentioned Rose to her. Mrs. Lewis didn't recognize Rose, but she found the other woman's piercing gaze to be quite unpleasant. Rose seemed almost disgusted. Luke, for his part, refused to even meet her eyes again. He turned to walk away as if she were a dangerous wasteland, a place where only death awaited. He had always believed he understood Rose, thinking of her as a kind and friendly woman. But now, quite suddenly, he felt as though she were a complete and unsettling stranger. She had become so cold and unrecognizable that it actually began to frighten him. This job was his one real chance to turn his life around, and he couldn't let it slip away. This money was meant for Mrs. Lewis's grandmother's medicine, yet now she was using it all to indulge her own relatives. Luke never judged her for her flaws. In fact, he felt that even if his own mother hadn't cared for him, he could never hate her. He remembered how much she valued her reputation, yet she was the one person he had needed most and the one he felt most grateful to. Without a word of complaint, he watched his hopes wither away until Rose suddenly called out for him to stop, her voice cold and steady. He was momentarily stunned, freezing in his tracks before slowly turning his head back toward her. As he faced her, his dark eyes betrayed a depth of emotion he couldn't quite hide. His nails dug into his palms as he tried not to look pathetic, wondering just how much responsibility he still felt toward her. She was fully invested in the film now, and as we know, she had the power to replace anyone she wished. She felt no responsibility toward him, especially since Justin was her official boyfriend now. She simply wanted to surprise her partner, and to her, Luke's presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Rose stared at him, her expression clouded with a deep and growing suspicion. For a brief moment, her mind drifted back to the version of him she had always known. He had always been so warm and friendly, always greeting her with a sweet, genuine smile on his face. Whenever he saw her, it seemed as though all the stress of his day would simply melt away. Even when she was reluctant to admit her feelings, she truly did enjoy the time they spent together. While she worked in her studio, he would be busy in the kitchen or keeping the house in order. He would sing moving songs, and even if they weren't in the same room, she felt comforted just knowing he was home. His presence alone brought her a sense of profound peace and quiet that she couldn't find anywhere else. In all those years, she had never seen that look of doubt and panic in his eyes, nor that startling sense of distance between them. Her heart fluttered slightly, and when she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly soft and gentle. Rose called out to him, asking Luke to sit down with her and Justin while they discussed some business matters. It turns out Justin had only agreed to dinner because his daily routine of sending her flowers and breakfast was causing quite a stir. Most people at the office were well aware of her marital status, and Justin's persistent attention had already drawn sharp criticism. With the office gossip mill churning, she hoped to use this dinner as a chance to finally set things straight with Justin. Luke hadn't expected to run into her here, especially since she usually maintains such a cold and distant demeanor. He didn't feel the need to explain himself, but seeing her silence, he remembered that his manager, Sarah, had already offered a casual explanation. He told her it wasn't necessary, addressing her formally as President Lewis, and noted that they had already finished their meal. He added that if there was nothing else, he would be on his way, speaking those words with a newfound firmness. He practically fled the scene, and by the time he reached the restaurant doors, he felt as though he'd been caught in a sudden downpour. He kept his mouth shut, his breath coming in hot, heavy gasps as a wave of genuine nausea washed over him. The silence between them stretched on until Sarah finally asked him what on earth was going on. She looked at him with genuine concern, asking if he actually knew that woman who had just approached them. He offered Sarah a quiet apology, admitting that he was simply feeling overwhelmed and unwell. He felt a pang of guilt for worrying her, knowing that Sarah had spent years pouring all her effort into building his career. He could only imagine how much she had worried, especially since he'd turned down so many great roles that required filming out of town. Because of his contract with Rose, he had always prioritized staying close to home, trying to keep his complicated life in order. That way, he wouldn't have to worry about his massive debt, all while continuing to look after his elderly Uncle Ben. He had passed on so many opportunities, yet Sarah always respected his decisions without ever once doubting his motives. This time, after landing a role in John Wan's new project, his first instinct was to share the news with Sarah, his loyal manager. He knew this wasn't just a professional milestone for him, but a massive boost for Sarah's agency as well. But in the end, Luke managed to surprise her, even as his heart was filled with a deep, heavy sense of guilt. Sarah, confused by his sudden change in tone, couldn't understand why he was apologizing to her. Perhaps it was because his work had been tainted. Sarah immediately closed her eyes, wondering what was truly happening. He decided he didn't want to hide the truth anymore, admitting that the woman they just saw was actually his wife. She lived in a mansion, and strangely enough, he saw her reflected in the very story of the movie they were making. Sarah was absolutely stunned, unable to believe that the powerful President Lewis was actually his wife. He confessed that he had been lying to himself, asking Sarah if she truly thought he was worthy of someone like Rose. In reality, they were only together because of a contract they had signed, which was set to expire in just 1 month. Once that time was up, it would all be over. Sarah was speechless, having never imagined things were so complicated. she realized that Rose likely believed her true partner was Justin, the man from the restaurant. Luke pointed out the obvious. Sarah now knew that Justin had no intention of supporting his career. Sarah gave a grim, joyless laugh, noting that Rose had invested in this film specifically to make Justin feel proud. With Justin working against him, Luke wondered how he could ever find a way to make himself proud again. We see the weight of the situation hit him. They had already decided to take his work away from him. There was simply too much information to process, and Sarah remained silent for a long time, unable to react. Immediately after the shock wore off, she felt a wave of uncontrollable anger rising within her. They were being far too cruel, weren't they? He told her it was better to just forget about it. He felt like weeping, knowing that since she invested in the film, she had every right to choose the actors she wanted. But Sarah couldn't accept that, arguing that he had been her husband, even if it was only a legal fiction. He had still been her husband, after all. He told Sarah not to worry, but she couldn't imagine staying calm now. Sarah was visibly shaken. She had worked so hard for this opportunity, and she couldn't understand how he could let it all go with a single sentence. She asked how he could simply abandon all their efforts, but Luke just looked away, gently shaking his head in quiet resignation. Deep down, he knew that regardless of the current pain, Rose had been his lifeline in the past. If it hadn't been for Rose's massive financial support, his Uncle Ben might not even be alive today, likely having succumbed to his illness long ago. That was a debt of gratitude he intended to remember forever, no matter the cost to his own pride. Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and pity, noting that he was far too kind for his own good, always putting others first. He told her that if this opportunity was lost, then it was simply lost. He seemed strangely at peace with it. Sarah promised to help him find another role, certain that his immense talent and acting skills couldn't be hidden forever by one person's spite. There would always be someone willing to recognize his worth. But as they stepped outside, they crossed paths with Rose and Justin. The meal wasn't even over, yet Rose had clearly lost her appetite. She walked with a hurried pace, her eyes tight with a tension she couldn't hide. Just as they were leaving, Justin caught her gaze, his eyes flickering with a dark suspicion as he began to mock Luke's situation. He remarked snidely that Luke hadn't wasted any time in finding himself a new girlfriend to lean on. He added with a smirk that while Sarah was pretty, she seemed a bit older than Rose, a petty observation, to be sure. He suggested that perhaps Luke knew his contract was ending and had already secured a new lover to take care of him. Justin continued his taunts, claiming he never expected someone who looked so innocent to play such a dirty game behind Rose's back. Rose remained silent, her gaze turning cold and clear as she processed the scene before her. Finally, she turned to Justin and told him quite firmly to stop sending flowers to her office every day. Justin was caught off guard by her tone. After all, in the eyes of the law, Luke and Rose were still very much a married couple. She pointed out that everyone was talking, and his constant, public displays of affection were starting to cause a real scandal. Justin tried to argue, reminding her of his feelings and how long he had waited while she used Luke as a mere substitute. Justin pressed her, asking why she felt the need to keep in contact with Luke now that he had finally returned to her side. To be honest, he truly couldn't wrap his head around the way Rose was thinking lately. On one hand, she had spent years acting the part of the devoted lover, even finding a substitute who looked just like him. She had meticulously maintained their home and cared for her memories of him, yet now that he was back, she seemed distant. Rose remained silent for a few moments before admitting that what she truly loved was the idea of their past romance. Back then, she genuinely believed that the connection between them was something profound and unbreakable. But perhaps that was her mistake, as she confessed that her feelings were starting to shift toward guilt and even a hint of disgust. She explained how she had spent years beautifying the image of him in her mind, treasuring every gift he had ever given her. She thought it was romantic, even convincing herself she would run back to him no matter what happened when he returned. As she spoke, she noticed the expectant look in Justin's eyes and suddenly went quiet, the words catching in her throat. But seeing him at the airport that day changed everything. She realized he no longer fit the idealized version she held in her heart. There was no great wave of expectation, and strangely enough, there was no real happiness either. Justin's frustration grew as he listened, his fingers clenching into tight fists as he demanded to know why things had changed. His eyes were clouded with a mix of resentment and disbelief, unable to accept her sudden change of heart. Rose simply brushed a stray lock of hair from her face and whispered that she didn't have an answer for him. The simple truth was that the feelings she once cherished so deeply had simply vanished into thin air. Justin gripped her arm, his voice dropping to a low hiss as he accused her of changing because of Luke. Rose was momentarily stunned by the accusation, finding herself unable to offer a single word in her own defense. He scoffed, asking what could possibly be so good about a man with no career, no family, and no future. He even pointed out that while Luke might be handsome, he considered himself far more attractive in every way that mattered. "Am I really worse than him?" Justin practically shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Rose simply looked up at him, her eyes filled with a silence that spoke louder than any words could. He pleaded with her, insisting she didn't need to be this way and admitting he knew he had been wrong back then. In a sudden surge of anger and regret, he claimed he never should have let things reach this point. He begged for another chance, promising her that this time, he would truly respect her wishes. He swore he would never force her into anything she didn't want to do ever again. Justin continued to plead for her favor, but Rose offered him no answer whatsoever. She turned her back on him and walked toward the station, leaving him to curse Luke under his breath. Justin's tone turned vicious as he muttered that he wasn't finished with Luke just yet. We return to Luke as he arrives home, where he finds an email waiting for him from his agent, Leonard. The message was brief, with Leonard simply acknowledging the situation regarding Rose. He told Luke not to worry, understanding that some things in life are simply beyond one's control. Leonard explained he wasn't holding Luke responsible and suggested they look for a new path forward. On the other end of the line, Rose called to offer a sincere apology, expressing her genuine happiness for him. She explained that due to unavoidable circumstances, their current collaboration simply couldn't continue. She promised that if a suitable project ever came up in the future, she would personally invite him to audition. Although Luke had already guessed the role was compromised, he still felt a pang of disappointment at the official news. It had been a truly wonderful opportunity, but as luck would have it, things just didn't go his way. Now, he had to find a new way to make money quickly so he could buy that laptop for Uncle Charlie. And so, our story takes us to the bustling streets of the city, where the local food stalls are just beginning to open. We find ourselves in Uncle Charlie's neighborhood, where Luke notices a young man in yellow approaching him just as he enters. Behind the boy, an entire crew has gathered, and it seems they are in the middle of a live broadcast. They were claiming that a single property in this part of the city costs at least $10 billion. For the more historic buildings, the price tag apparently jumps to a staggering $100 billion. The host tells his audience that today, he is going to take them on a personal tour of the area. Watching the screen, Luke suddenly remembers that the previous owner of his body was also a content creator. The account was named The Escaping Wind, and it focused primarily on random music uploads. He pulls out his phone to check the channel, finding many videos, but only 3 originals among the various covers. The original creator seemed to share Luke's reserved personality, as none of the videos actually showed his face. There was also a karaoke-style track, and Luke noted with interest that the volume in the video wasn't very high. The channel's first major production had only reached about 700,000 or 800,000 views. He likes the idea, thinking that perhaps he should record an original music video and upload it himself. The thought strikes him suddenly, especially considering his current vocal range and abilities. He realizes it's difficult to find other ways to make quick money through random opportunities alone. Relying solely on acting to earn enough for everything he needs simply isn't practical right now. Becoming a music influencer, however, might just be a brilliant way to generate the income he needs. In his past life, after all, he had worked at a music company and studied at a professional academy. He realizes he remembers many of his past works. If he releases them in this world, he might actually become famous. The idea takes hold of him so quickly that he can almost feel his heart racing with excitement. As soon as he returns home, he grabs some paper and, within minutes, has transcribed an entire song and its lyrics. At the same time, we see him refreshing the software on his computer to set up the music, working until 5:30 when the track finally takes shape. Because he lacks professional recording equipment, the final audio quality isn't quite as polished as he would like. But this is his current reality, and to be honest, he really can't ask for much more right now. He logs onto the copyright registration site to secure his rights to the work before doing anything else. After that, he writes a short post and uploads the video to the platform, stretching his tired limbs with a bored sigh. Checking the clock, he realizes an hour has passed and it's already 6, so he immediately gets up to start cooking dinner. However, just as he finishes his meal, the sudden sound of a door echoing through the house catches his attention. The door had been shut tight, but hearing someone enter, he goes over to see who it is. A moment later, he realizes that his roommate has returned home. He heads to the kitchen to wash the dishes, but just as he's returning to his room, Sarah stops him in his tracks. "Luke, let's talk," she says, and we see that her serious tone catches him a bit off guard. Deep down, he feels a flicker of hope, wondering if she finally wants to discuss canceling his restrictive contract. It would be impossible to say he didn't feel some resentment towards Sarah after everything that happened today. After all, that acting role was incredibly important for his future and his very survival. But he also recognizes that she is the one investing the actual money into these projects. It is her business to decide who to hire, and besides, the lead actor, Jake, is her actual boyfriend. Jake clearly adores her to his very core, and Luke can understand why he would want to protect her interests. Furthermore, if it weren't for her providing the massive sum for his medical bills, Uncle Charlie wouldn't even know who Luke was. It was a life-saving favor, and despite his frustration, he knows Sarah's personal weaknesses aren't exactly a crime. What right does he have to hold her responsible? He wonders if she is truly about to set him free from the contract. He speaks up quickly, telling her that he agrees and is ready to move forward. He asks if she can spare some time tomorrow morning so they can head to the civil affairs office. He wants a divorce, but as we see from Sarah's expression, that wasn't the conversation she intended to have. She has no intention of ending their arrangement. She was actually just worried about his health after seeing him eat. She meant to ask about his well-being, not hear a divorce proposal, and suddenly her face pales under the light. She tells him firmly that he doesn't need to do this, trying to maintain the status quo. When they signed the contract, they both agreed it was merely a business arrangement and nothing more. To her, that marriage certificate was just a formality, a necessary part of their deal. She tells him she doesn't want him having any unnecessary ideas, making sure he understands her position. Over the years, he had heard similar cold words from Jake many times before. It seems Jake often used that same dismissive tone when speaking to him. But this is the very first time he has heard such a sharp warning come from Sarah herself. In that moment, he feels his heart tighten, even though he was the one who brought it up. He senses her suspicion and dissatisfaction as she instinctively tries to shut down his line of thinking. To avoid further conflict, he assures her that she can rest easy knowing he understands his limits. He knows his place perfectly well and promises he won't harbor any inappropriate feelings. Once the contract ends, he will leave her and Jake behind, ensuring he never crosses their path again. He tells her she can be completely at peace regarding that particular matter. Hearing this only makes Sarah feel more uneasy, and she gives a curt reply before retreating into her studio. He watches her go, and after pushing her away like that, he finds himself feeling deeply dissatisfied. As we see, Luke's only real desire now is to leave this place as quickly as possible. He begins to think that perhaps it would be for the best, considering his situation. In his mind, moving on of your own accord and being chased away are two very different things. But since Sarah insists on keeping him around, he decides he will stay for this final month. He accepts that he will endure some sorrow, and then he'll take the settlement money to save his life. The following morning, we return to Luke as he receives an unexpected phone call from his agent. She tells him something big has happened. Her voice is so unsettled that his heart begins to race. It turns out someone has issued a blacklisting order against him, effectively trying to ban him from the industry. His expression freezes for a moment, and his very first thought is that Sarah must be behind this. Sarah comes from an old, wealthy family with immense resources and a vast network of powerful connections. Only people with that kind of reach could do this. He never expected his rejection to lead to such a backlash. It seems they are intent on destroying his livelihood, and his breathing quickens as anger begins to take hold. His nails dig into his palms, his mind clouded with a heavy mix of suspicion and growing anxiety. As his thoughts spin, he feels the physical toll of his illness while trying to finish his breakfast. He finds it hard to catch his breath, and his world begins to tilt as his heart hammers in his chest. He collapses to the floor, and just as he tries to get up, Sarah emerges from the master bathroom. Her face pales when she sees him, and she rushes over, clearly intending to help him up. He roughly brushes her hand away and struggles to his feet, feeling a deep sense of bitterness. She tells him he looks terrible and insists on taking him to the hospital, already reaching for her bag. He snaps at her, asking if she thinks he's some kind of helpless pet she can just order around. Sarah looks at him with a growing sense of unease, while Luke's eyes are filled with a heavy mix of resentment and forced patience. To be honest, Sarah has never seen him act this way before. It's a side of him she doesn't recognize. In her memory, he had always been kind and patient with her, never once showing true anger in all these years. He had always treated her with respect, and occasionally, she even thought she saw a quiet love reflected in his gaze. But now, he addresses her coldly by her full name, his eyes burning with a fury that makes her feel like a complete stranger. She seems genuinely unsure of what she could have possibly done to provoke such a visceral reaction from him. He tells her flatly that from this day forward, he wants nothing more to do with her. Luke makes it clear that he is finished. He simply doesn't want her in his life anymore. His eyes are rimmed with red, shimmering with the weight of unshed tears he refuses to let fall. At this moment, he feels deeply unsettled. Perhaps the love is gone, but after so many years, he still considered her a friend. Now, he is forced to face the harsh reality of the world, realizing he was wrong to trust her as a companion. It feels as though she is intent on destroying him, and so, he decides it is finally time to walk away. After delivering those final words, he turns and pulls the door open without looking back. Sarah remains frozen in the same spot, looking utterly trapped by the weight of his rejection. She sinks onto the edge of the bed, her hand over her mouth, feeling a sudden and overwhelming sense of fear. She can only replay the scene in her head, wondering what could drive such a gentle man to treat her this way. She realizes she knows nothing of his life or his friends, seeing him only as a struggling, minor actor. She had remained blissfully ignorant, never bothering to look deeper into who he actually was. Eventually, she finds herself entering his bedroom, a space she had never once stepped into since they began living together. And there, she finally discovers the recording of him secretly playing that haunting melody on the piano. We see her standing at the doorway, hesitating for a moment before she finally decides to step inside. As she enters, the room is revealed in sharp detail, and we notice her pajamas seem out of place in such a prepared space. The interior design is remarkably precise, though to be honest, the room still feels somewhat lacking in personal warmth. Every detail seems designed to improve the atmosphere, giving the bedroom a surprisingly natural and refined essence. She moves through the space cautiously, her eyes darting around as if she expects to find some hidden secret. It is a scene that feels almost like a quiet documentary of a life she never truly bothered to understand. We learn that Sarah had originally bought this piano for her boyfriend, Mark, planning to give it to him upon her return. She often worked late, and one morning she returned to find Luke sitting at the keys. She was furious, as the piano was meant for Mark. She had envisioned Mark playing moving melodies for her, yet here was another man touching her precious gift. In that moment, she felt her boundaries were violated and lashed out at Luke with a harshness she now deeply regrets. Luke had apologized repeatedly, promising never to touch it again, and from that day on, the piano became a symbol of his sadness. The entire room remains bright and clean, yet the piano sits there like a silent reminder of her past cruelty. We catch a glimpse of Mark's expression, which for a fleeting second betrays a flicker of something unexpected. Despite his confidence, Sarah didn't immediately cast him, choosing instead to consult with the department managers first. Mark's acting was average at best, certainly better than those who just stare at the camera, but his looks were undeniable. He fit the lead role perfectly, and after several long discussions, the team finally decided he would be their leading man. What we didn't expect was that Luke would also be connected to this production, specifically to the role Mark was playing. Sarah is stunned to see Luke's script marked up with red tape, suddenly remembering how silent he had been the night before. She recalls talking to Mark about removing Luke from the team, while Luke sat right there, hearing every word of his own dismissal. As she picks up his notes, her hands tremble. She finally recognizes the depth of the sorrow she had so blindly ignored. We see that Sarah didn't recognize the script notes Luke had given to John. Earlier that morning, she had angrily complained to the director about a young actor using his influence to steal a lead role. She believed this young actor had neither the talent nor the style for the part, and felt that if he remained in the production, the entire project would be ruined. But Sarah isn't one to be swayed by others, so she took matters into her own hands and called the planning department to investigate the situation further. She demanded they contact the director to find a replacement, never expecting for a moment that the talentless actor being discussed was actually Luke. As the truth dawns on her, Sarah's expression darkens. She wonders who Luke really is and how she could have remained so blind to his connections. In all these years, Luke had never asked for a single favor, and knowing his pride, it seemed impossible that he would use influence to secure a job. She realizes the director had manipulated her, and a sharp pain strikes Sarah's heart. She had always hoped to build a career in the industry on her own merit. She wanted to make her family proud and earn their acceptance, but now, in her attempt to push away a perceived rival, she had made a terrible mistake. The realization that she used such petty tactics to get rid of Luke makes her feel foolish and utterly deceived. To be honest, she should have seen it coming. If she hadn't stumbled upon the truth today, she might have continued this path indefinitely. Immediately, Sarah calls the executive producer to explain the director's lies. The producer is confused, noting that while he didn't know where the deception began, Luke was a valuable client and a talent that shouldn't be cast aside so easily. Not long ago, the director had received a call from the family asking if he knew who was sabotaging Luke's career, and his first thought had been Sarah. He told himself he was just a small player who hadn't cheated anyone, and that only someone like Sarah would have the reach to kick Luke off the team. The director truly believed Sarah was the culprit, and in a tense moment, he couldn't help but speak up as Sarah's voice turned sharp and defensive. He asks her directly, his voice filled with genuine concern, wanting to know exactly who had been deceiving Luke all this time. Luke usually maintains a cold, detached personality, rarely showing emotion even in the cutthroat business world, but now he displays a strange flicker of resentment. As he stands up abruptly, the director is startled and quickly tries to explain himself, apologizing to the chairman for any misunderstanding. He insists that the chairman is the only one with the actual power and motivation to influence the production's outcome. Sarah finally understands the gravity of the situation. In an industry fueled by money and connections, her family's influence is a double-edged sword. Since she had removed Luke's team just the day before, it was only natural for the director to assume she was the one pulling the strings. Sarah pauses, her voice turning cold and sharp as she insists she didn't do any of this, but promises to investigate the matter thoroughly. We see that Sarah has never been fond of coffee, preferring tea instead. She is usually meticulous and skilled, though she rarely stays late at the office. It is quite strange for her to be at the company so late today, yet Sarah gives the order to meet at the legal department's private lounge. Half an hour later, a middle-aged man in gold-rimmed glasses enters, greeting Chairman Sarah with a practiced, professional smile. He asks with a hint of curiosity if Sarah had been looking for him specifically. Sarah closes her eyes for a moment before looking down at him from her position of authority, her silence speaking volumes. The tension in the room is palpable as they both wait for the next move in this high-stakes game of influence. She remains silent, letting the weight of the situation settle over them like a heavy fog. We learn that Luke had spent $10,000 on specialized music equipment and a vintage guitar to perfect his craft. He had used nearly all his savings to hire an engineer, insisting that every tool be perfectly calibrated after yesterday's disappointing recording session. Today, he simply spent the money on a new set of gear. It wasn't particularly exciting, but it was acceptable for his needs. The final result would certainly be superior to yesterday's effort, and after storing his tools, he checks his tablet with a flicker of interest. At the Maple Leaf Cafe, a man named Simon smiles warmly, noting that this is the very first time Sarah has invited him out. He looks like a cat who finally caught the cream, offering her a bouquet of her favorite flowers, though Sarah's expression remains icy. She takes the flowers with a lazy, indifferent gesture and sets them behind her, briefly thanking Simon for coming. Simon sits before her and asks why she chose a cafe today, since he remembers her favorite place has always been the traditional tea house. Sarah asks if he remembers the first time they met at a tea house. Simon is surprised she recalls something from 4 or 5 years ago. She looks at him, remembering how he used to wait outside the school near that very same tea house. Simon is deeply moved, thinking Sarah is being kind, unaware that this invitation might be her way of finally settling their shared history. The server approaches with their order, and as the tea is placed on the table, we see the conversation is about to take a serious turn. Sarah remarks that she didn't expect him to remember her preferences so well. As the tea is served, Simon is visibly surprised, and Sarah slowly adds half a teaspoon of sugar. She gently stirs the tea, a simple gesture that makes her seem like a distant, unattainable treasure to him, a dream hidden behind a veil of mist. Thinking he finally has a chance with a woman like her, Simon feels a surge of pride. But after a sip of tea, Sarah suddenly tells him not to contact her again. Simon is stunned, his eyes widening as if he can't believe what he's hearing. His voice catches in his throat, but Sarah continues, explaining that she doesn't like being deceived. Simon tries to maintain a clean, innocent tone while denying it, but Sarah looks at him with a flicker of disappointment in her beautiful eyes. She tells him he is still lying to himself and suggests he reflect on his actions. She stands to leave, wanting to end this matter with some dignity. There are many guests nearby, and she has no desire to cause a scene. Simon stands up abruptly, asking through gritted teeth if this is all because of Luke. He admits he did it, but asks whose fault it really is. He reminds her that he has loved her for years and demands to know why her attitude changed the moment he returned. He scoffs that Luke is just a placeholder, a temporary shield she found, while he is the one who should be her boyfriend. He hates seeing them so close. He asks if he's wrong, but Sarah counters that it's his attitude. He expects hope to be handed to him, only to complain when things don't go his way. She wonders what else he could possibly want and asks if he's considered his family or his parents. As Simon keeps pressing, Sarah raises her hands to stop the conversation. She admits she once had expectations for him, hoping he would be kind rather than arrogant. To be honest, she had truly believed in his potential. She thought he had a business-minded spirit and would conquer the entertainment industry. Even her family would have supported him, making it impossible for her to resist him. But instead of working hard, he chose to be a lazy traffic star. He refused to improve his acting or practice his singing, preferring the comfort of easy fame. Now, he's even stooped to sabotaging a minor actor, trying to block Luke's career. Sarah's expression turns cold as she asks what qualities he actually has left to love. Furthermore, she clarifies that her relationship with Luke is strictly professional. They are colleagues, and everything between them is transparent, unlike his schemes. She notes that Luke has looked after her for years without asking for anything, while Simon, wanting to be her boyfriend, tried to ruin someone else's path. She asks how he can be so disgusting. Simon's face darkens as Sarah turns to walk away, and he finally stammers out a desperate apology. He claims he was only afraid of losing her, and that's why he made those choices. Sarah simply gives him a calm, chilling smile. She mentions the name Leo, and Simon is struck with shock. Leo is Sarah's younger brother, and the two are very close, a detail that changes everything. We see that Simon wanted to lash out just like Leo, but Sarah cut him off, revealing she knew he had been secretly sabotaging Luke's work for years. She noted how those injuries had become quite serious and told him firmly to stop following her and stay away from Luke. It seemed the matter was settled. But then, Simon suddenly cried out, asking if she had forgotten her promise to give him 3 chances. This made Sarah remember a night on a lonely mountain road. Years ago, she had been surrounded after her motorcycle broke down and her phone was smashed. It was Simon who arrived with help to rescue her that night. Deep down, she had felt a sincere gratitude and promised that no matter what mistakes he made in the future, she would grant him 3 chances to make amends. Now, Simon pleaded for just one more opportunity, swearing he would change. Sarah looked at him for a long time before quietly acknowledging her promise. She reminded him that while 3 chances should be plenty, he had already used 2. Leaving without a word years ago was the first, today was the second. Simon felt a surge of hope, but Sarah was already moving on. As she told him to go home, she couldn't help but recall the lonely guilt of that night on the mountain. Simon had saved her back then, and though she had looked after him for years out of kindness, his recent behavior was something she simply couldn't ignore. Returning to the office, Sarah found her assistant, Sophie, eating lunch and listening to music. Sophie was surprised to see her back from her meeting so soon. Sarah explained she only stayed for a single cup of coffee. She started toward her private office, but then she suddenly paused and turned back around. She asked Sophie for the name of the song she was playing. Sophie excitedly explained it was by a new creator called Storm Shelter, and the track was titled No Regrets. Sophie mentioned it was released just yesterday and already had nearly 1 million likes. People loved the melody, even if the recording quality was a bit lacking. Sarah opened the platform to find the channel. The description was simple, yet haunting, speaking of a love so deep it would take 3 lifetimes to resolve. The production was basic, but it drew people in. The raw audio captured a sense of eternal longing that seemed to resonate with everyone who heard it. The song carried a flavor of profound sadness, painting a picture of windswept beaches and a love as fleeting as a moon's reflection in the water. Sarah, who usually listened to music without much emotion, found herself struck by the lyrics. We see her return to the most poignant parts of the melody. The song was delicate and easy to understand, the kind of tune that stays with you after only a few listens. It was, to be honest, quite captivating. Sarah knew instantly that this theme was destined to go viral. As she listened, Sophie asked if the singer's voice sounded familiar to her. Sophie pointed out that the blue flooring in the video looked exactly like the floor in Sarah's own home. Sarah leaned in closer, realizing she was right. This discovery left Sarah utterly stunned. Looking closely at the video, she realized those blue tiles were unmistakable, and she found herself listening to the creator's voice once more. She was certain now that this creator was Luke. At that moment, Sarah felt a wave of genuine surprise. She knew he liked music, but she had no idea just how talented he truly was. She remembered him singing in bars, but the depth of his ability was a revelation. As she read the lyrics, she realized the music and the setting were all things he had crafted himself. Having just returned to her office, Sarah couldn't keep these thoughts from weighing on her heart. She opened the comments section and was pleased to see others felt the same way she did. The listeners loved his voice, calling it sweet and sensitive. The song seemed to warn against being foolish and hurting those who are good to you, for some loves, once lost, never return. Sarah felt a pang of surprise reading the comments about not mistreating those who care for you. It made her think of Luke's place in her heart and how he had slowly returned to her thoughts. The lyrics spoke of sending sunshine into someone's heart. To be perfectly honest, during her year with Luke, they hadn't shared many grand memories, aside from the time he came to her rescue. Most of their dates had been simple affairs, movies, dinners, and coffee. Now, those memories felt like they belonged to a distant past, from a time before life became so incredibly busy. Back then, he was already rising in his career and staying occupied, while Sarah was equally focused on her own professional path, only occasionally catching glimpses of him in passing. She reflected on their 3 years together and realized she hadn't done anything particularly romantic. She hadn't taken him shopping or on proper dates. Those were things Luke usually avoided. And yet, in the small details of daily life, he had organized everything for her with such clarity and care. He had turned their routine into something stable and nurturing. It is often this kind of quiet care that leaves the deepest impression on the heart. In this regard, Sarah couldn't help but feel a bit foolish for how she had viewed their connection. She had insisted theirs was merely a professional relationship, a bond between two parts that could never truly merge. Suddenly, the memory of him flickered brightly in her mind. She tried to push those shimmering shadows aside, turning off her phone to focus on work. But not long after, she couldn't resist checking again, clicking like on the video before continuing. Across the digital landscape, the song was spreading further and further. We shouldn't be surprised to find that the video soon reached 100,000 likes. With 200,000 followers now watching, largely thanks to a shout-out from a major influencer, Luke felt a surge of gratitude and sent a private message of thanks. Seeing his fan base grow every night, he recognized a golden opportunity. He decided it was time to release a new track while the momentum was high, choosing 8 o'clock in the evening. The value of his work was rising, but he wasn't in a rush to post everything at once. He planned to wait until the initial online frenzy calmed down before sharing more. He stretched his tired body and headed to the kitchen to prepare a healthy meal. Meanwhile, back in her office, Sarah was reviewing reports, her head throbbing with a painful tension. Her team's focus had been on the high-end beverage market, but sales for their top brands had begun to slip compared to the previous year. It was a difficult situation, to say the least. The year before, Sarah's vice president, Sandra, had warned her that the competition was fierce, with rival teams recruiting famous stars to lead their investment ventures. With endless promotional events on the horizon, we see that they had to move quickly. Otherwise, their market share would be completely shattered by the competition. Sarah had been refining a plan for some time, and after briefing Sandra on the details, Sandra promised to execute it immediately just as Luke arrived at the office. Luke had brought some medicine and was waiting patiently in the lounge. Sarah was genuinely surprised to see him, admitting she'd been so busy she almost forgot him. She worried he might have felt rejected or lost his confidence, but he simply offered the medicine as if nothing had happened, leaving her with a very complex expression. She asked him to come in, which surprised her assistant, Mike. Out of respect for Sarah, Mike showed him in, though he found the situation quite unusual. In all these years, Sarah had never invited him into her private office. Once inside, she explained how Julian and the company managers had essentially deceived her. They had used Chloe's work without giving Luke credit, claiming he was just a young actor without the skill to earn a role fairly. To be honest, it was a low blow. She clarified that while Chloe's project couldn't be changed now, she would find him a far more significant role in another production she was personally overseeing. Sarah felt a deep sense of guilt for the way he was being treated, but Luke calmly told her that she shouldn't feel responsible for the company's internal politics. He thanked her for her kindness and for offering to help him find other work. Sarah was a bit taken aback by his composure during such a pivotal moment. She had always wanted to offer him a breakout role, and this was his chance to star directly in a major television series starting this Sunday. Luke lowered his head in thought. While he certainly wanted a meaningful role, he insisted she didn't owe him any compensation for the previous misunderstanding. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions, gratitude mixed with a lingering sense of hesitation about the path ahead of him. Deep down, he felt the weight of the gift she was offering, knowing that such opportunities in this industry are rarely ever easy to come by. He took a moment to steady his thoughts, realizing this could be the turning point he had been waiting for. Ultimately, he accepted. Meanwhile, Sarah made a call to arrange for school supplies to be purchased the next morning, setting aside a budget of $100,000. She also ordered clothes and toys for all the children in the grade, wanting to ensure no one was left out of her charitable gesture. In addition, she prepared $10,000 to be deposited into the Children's Hope Foundation account to support their ongoing needs. The following morning, her assistant came in to inform Sarah that everything she had requested had been purchased and was ready for delivery. We see that she had purchased quite a lot of items. Was she planning to visit the children at the orphanage today? Over the years, this sort of charitable work had become a regular part of her routine. Sarah had supported over a dozen primary schools and frequently visited orphanages and families to personally oversee the charity work. Her assistant, Bella, often accompanied her. She wondered if there was any pressing business to attend to that morning. Sarah was busy managing her tasks and asked about the current workload she had on her plate. Without even looking up from her desk, she inquired about her schedule. Bella checked the logs and noted a business meeting at 10 o'clock. Sarah simply asked to push it to a later time. She was determined to finish her work by 9:30. After that, she took Bella with her to the orphanage, though she couldn't help but wonder why the place was so far away. As the car turned toward the outskirts of the city, a new 3-story building appeared in a bright, open clearing. A few hundred meters ahead, we see a small courtyard that was currently undergoing some repairs. As they approached the construction area, they found the iron gates firmly shut. Above the entrance, a sign was visible that read, "The Sunshine Happy Home." Bella explained that her research showed this happy home had been founded by an elderly couple. It was a semi-public foster home, operating independently without any direct support from the government. The land itself also belonged to the family of the elderly founders. 3 years ago, a massive fire had broken out here, and the flames were truly devastating. The entire home was destroyed in the blaze, and the director suffered very serious injuries. The director was still receiving treatment in the hospital. Hearing about 3 years ago, Sarah couldn't help but think of Luke. She remembered the hotel manager mentioning back then that Luke was desperate for money and worked 3 days straight. He had been working day and night to earn every penny, though at the time, she hadn't thought much of it. In our world, so many people are like him, working tirelessly every single day just to make ends meet. But as she thought back to that fire 3 years ago, she realized things weren't quite what they seemed. She decided it was time to head inside, and Sarah could feel a strange sense of anticipation building. They approached the iron gates and made a call. A moment later, one of the heavy doors slowly creaked open. The atmosphere inside was quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Everything felt soft and still, almost like a dream, as they stepped onto the grounds. It was a complete change of pace from the busy city life they had left behind. Waiting for them was the head of the home, a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Lewis. Sarah stepped forward with a warm smile, explaining they had brought donations and hoped they weren't intruding. Upon hearing about the gifts, the staff member became visibly excited and quickly invited them both inside. Sarah immediately instructed her team to bring in the school supplies, clothes, and toys they had packed. Mrs. Lewis apologized for not having fine wine to offer, asking them to settle for a simple drink instead. The woman personally prepared a cup of tea for each of them, a small but genuine gesture of hospitality. Sarah thanked her, noting how incredibly kind she was to welcome them so warmly. She mentioned hearing that the couple had founded this home themselves, wondering how difficult it must be to care for so many. Mrs. Lewis admitted it was quite a challenge, though a gentle smile never left her face as she spoke of the orphans. The hardest part, she confessed, was seeing the children struggle with the pain of being abandoned by their parents. Sarah took her tea and walked into a room filled with photos and awards, which even lined the walls of the staircase. She was stunned to find that nearly half of the awards belonged to one person, a young man named Luke. She asked in complete disbelief how he could have earned so many, her voice trailing off as she stared at the wall. Sarah and her companion exchanged a look. That last question had led them back to a very interesting point. 3 years ago, what had happened? Mrs. Lewis's eyes welled up as she recalled a short circuit that sparked a massive fire, consuming the entire facility. It was Luke who, regardless of the danger, saved the children one by one, though he suffered terrible burns across his body in the process. After that, Luke made a difficult choice. He decided to drop out of school and head to the city, working 3 jobs at a time. To cover his grandfather's medical expenses, he sacrificed everything, even though, as Mrs. Lewis noted through tears, he had loved acting since he was a boy. He used to tell her and his grandfather that he wanted to be a star when he grew up, but to save his family, he had to change course. And so, he repeatedly turned his back on his dreams. At this moment, Sarah was deeply moved by his selflessness. He had been a brilliant student at the Drama Academy, but after dropping out, he worked tirelessly just to keep his grandfather alive. He was so grateful for his grandfather's care that he eventually met a benefactor who lent him $500 million to rebuild this home. On top of that, he also secured the funds needed for his grandfather's long-term recovery. Over the last few years, he has continued to send money every single month without fail. The children are doing well now, and it is all thanks to his quiet, steady devotion to this place. Hearing Mrs. Lewis's words, Sarah felt her heart ache. The truth was far more surprising than she ever imagined. They were overcome with emotion, realizing that beneath his quiet exterior was a man of such immense kindness. He had never once boasted about his past or the wealth he had managed to generate for others. As the old woman continued, Sarah felt as though her previous perception of Luke was shattering into pieces. It was a profound revelation for her. To Mrs. Lewis, Luke wasn't just a former ward, he was a hero. Is that really the same man? She wondered, her eyes wide with a new sense of clarity. She had always assumed he was someone who relied on others for support just to survive in this world. But she never expected that he was the one working so hard to build a home for others and heal his family. He had worked so incredibly hard, while his grandfather remained in a silent, fragile state. He lived with me for 3 years, and during that time, he spent almost every penny he earned on medicine and care. His monthly income never exceeded $2,000 or $3,000, so he never had the chance to save anything for himself. Sarah had assumed he had $500 million to spend, but he was never satisfied because he was constantly working. Now, we begin to understand the truth. He never actually kept any of that money for his own use. Every bit of it was invested in rebuilding the family home and funding his grandfather's long road to recovery. Mrs. Lewis looked at Sarah and asked if she was truly a member of the prestigious Miller family. The old woman grew emotional, explaining that Luke was like a brother to her and thanked Sarah for everything he had done for the children. She confessed her husband wouldn't even be alive today without him, prompting Sarah to quickly offer her some comfort. Mrs. Lewis noted that she always tried to help him because of his immense talent and his tireless work ethic over the years. The old woman wept, saying the family had finally found some luck after Luke's own parents had abandoned him. Even though his maternal grandparents had been led astray by others, she felt a sense of peace knowing he had found good people now. Sarah marveled at how he excelled despite his circumstances, and she decided then and there to donate $100 million to the hospital. She told the woman that if any issues arose in the future, she could contact her vice president at any moment. As Sarah spoke, she handed the elderly woman a business card as a practical gesture of her support. The old woman was completely taken aback, and her first instinct, naturally, was to try and refuse such a generous offer. She couldn't believe it was happening, insisting that Sarah had already done more than enough for everyone. Sarah gently took the old woman's hands in her own to steady her. Her voice was soft and kind, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about her changing heart. She insisted that the children deserved a better life, and this was the way to ensure it. There was no need to refuse him anymore. After finishing her lunch, the grandmother seemed truly at peace. Once Sarah and Luke's grandfather had finished their meal, they quickly went on their way. The old man couldn't help but weep, feeling that life had been far from fair to someone as kind as Luke. Sarah realized she had completely misjudged him, once thinking he was arrogant, but now she understood his quiet sacrifice. Her thoughts wouldn't stop racing as a bittersweet smile touched her lips, masking the growing ache in her heart. We learned that he is battling cancer, a simple diagnosis that felt like a sudden storm cloud over a bright sky. As they headed back to the car, the weight of the news settled in. He had been diagnosed with spinal cancer. He was already in the final stages, with perhaps only a single month left to live. Sarah offered a faint, sad smile, and for a long moment, the two of them sat in heavy silence. The car continued forward, leaving nothing but their shared sorrow hanging in the air. The next morning, Luke felt a surge of excitement as he opened his computer to check his progress. 500,000 views, a number he loved to see, never imagining his video would reach such a massive audience so quickly. And it wasn't just the views. His fan base had suddenly exploded by 300,000 new followers. By the time evening rolled around, his subscriber count had already surpassed the 500,000 mark. He quickly scrolled through the comment section to see what the world was saying about his work. A popular influencer named Mia had recommended him, which, naturally, was a very pleasant surprise. Fans were raving, claiming they had been listening to his story-driven songs all day while they worked. They were practically begging him to release a new track immediately, calling out for more of his music. It seems many were already excited to hear his modern take on these classic melodies. He even noticed the names of several major influencers who had taken an interest in his talent. We see him opening their accounts, only to discover that they were all recommending his work for free. These new subscriptions were incredibly important to him, so he quickly sent a private message to each person to express his gratitude. After that, he spent the entire day at home, focusing all his energy on composing and illustrating new songs. During this time, the Miller family reached out. Even though the previous restrictions had been lifted, public opinion still lingered. Many companies and directors were still questioning whether he would be difficult to work with under these circumstances. If this had happened yesterday, he might have felt tense, but now his heart remained perfectly calm. The results of his new songs were looking quite brilliant, to say the least. He told himself that if he continued at this pace, the next release wouldn't be too bad either. On these short video platforms, the quality of the work is really all that matters. Personal interests and politics seemed far less important in this new digital world. For someone like Luke, who possessed a touch of social intensity, this was simply the best way to work. Writing lyrics, producing music, and recording, it all came together in one creative burst. By 6:30, he had finished 2 new songs and felt a great sense of accomplishment. The creative process continued late into the evening as he refined every note. He lost track of time, fully immersed in his world of melodies. Naturally, he understood the ultimate goal of this musical group he was forming. On his desk, the messy brushes were scattered among sheets filled with lyrics and musical curves. There was even a guitar lying on the floor, a sign of his long day of work. When the CEO returned, Luke immediately apologized, promising to clean up the room right away. He felt a bit nervous, knowing the man had a slight obsession with keeping things tidy. He usually tried his best to keep the room tidy every day, but the exhaustion of the evening had made him relax his standards. As we watch the CEO, Leo, his expression becomes unreadable and complex, yet he remains perfectly silent. Luke broke the silence, asking Leo if he had eaten yet and offering to head to the kitchen to cook. After he finished tidying up the workspace, he began making plans for their dinner. But then, Leo spoke up, telling Luke that he didn't need to be quite so formal with him anymore. Those words caught Luke off guard, making him feel as though the rigid walls of their professional relationship were finally crumbling. To be honest, he had always assumed that keeping a respectful distance was the most natural way to behave. He mentioned his visit to Hope Tower earlier that day, but Leo's next words nearly made him stumble in shock. Luke had only intended to donate some supplies. He never expected the conversation to take such a personal turn. Leo reminded him that $500 million had been spent to rebuild the tower and treat his grandfather's illness. As Leo watched him closely, Luke gave a firm nod, acknowledging the weight of that debt. It had been a true emergency, and that money had saved both the building and his grandfather's life. He expressed his deepest gratitude, sincerely thanking Leo for everything he had done. He vowed that no matter what happened next, he would do everything in his power to make things right. At this, Leo's gaze softened, though it remained layered with complicated emotions. He asked Luke if he had truly been looking out for him all these years. Was it all just for the sake of helping? Luke remained silent, letting the question hang in the air. Deep down, he wondered if Leo now understood his past at the tower, perhaps feeling a mix of friendship and awkwardness. Regardless, the realization made Luke feel a profound sense of importance in his own heart. Even though their social standings were worlds apart, he truly hoped they could finally become real friends. However, the truth of the matter was beginning to settle, clear and steady as falling water. It allowed Luke to realize quite clearly that in Leo's heart, he wasn't just some helpless child. A quiet sense of self-worth began to stir deep within his soul, perhaps for the first time. He didn't mind that his old illusions were being dismantled. After all, what did he truly hope to become? Could he really be a friend to a powerful CEO? He wondered if a low-level actor like himself could truly help him. Soon, the comforting aroma of food began to drift out from the kitchen, filling the air. Meanwhile, we see Leo staring at his computer screen, his expression tense and filled with lingering doubt. 3 years ago, when his old friend Jack left, he had felt a similar wave of deep emotion. Today, just as he started to relax, a single sentence made his state of suspicion even more intense. Suddenly, the phone chimed. It was a message from his assistant, Quinn. It seemed that Ryan, a popular creator on the platform, had just released a brand new piece of work. Quite by accident, Leo found the new video that had just been uploaded to the site. The posting time was barely 10 minutes before he had returned home, which was a curious coincidence. The rumors and words flashing across the screen seemed to strike a direct blow to his heart. The lyrics spoke of a prayer, not for a future life, but for this relationship to be seen clearly once more. It was a melody very similar to a previous song titled Sleeping Lover. Leo's eyes flickered with a sudden intensity. With a hint of excitement, he pressed the replay button. The song began to play softly, the melody developing slowly and gracefully through the speakers. A sense of quiet sorrow and confusion seemed to hang in the air between them. And then, just after the introduction, Luke's voice emerged, falling as gently as a summer rain. The lyrics spoke of the moonlight shining upon his face, casting a soft glow over the scene. Deep down, he felt as though his very appearance was beginning to change under its light. This overwhelming wave of emotion was being carried forward, word by word, through the lyrics. It felt like a magical potion, one that held an immense and almost tightening power over the listener. The song was truly breathtaking, possessing a raw intensity that seemed to pierce directly through the heart. Leo's expression became increasingly focused as he realized just how captivating this piece truly was. As the song reached its core, the vocals grew deeper, carrying a weight that felt almost physical. It was like an endless wanderer's grief, surfacing alongside a desperate attempt to find peace. The singer asked if they could meet again, having prayed to the heavens for thousands of years. The lyrics were grand and shocking, and for a moment, Leo seemed to envision a solitary figure. He imagined someone kneeling in prayer before an ancient stone statue, enduring its silent, cold gaze. We see the passage of time depicted in the song, as the world changes and the years slip away. And yet, time itself could not shake the resolve or the effort of the one who waited. Driven by a flicker of hope, Luke expressed this deep longing through a voice that touched the soul. It was only then that Leo truly discovered just how powerful Luke's singing ability actually was. He realized that only a true artist can make others feel the music rather than just hitting high notes. Leo found himself moved to tears as the voice asked once more if they could ever meet again. The protagonist of the song had offered his prayers to the heavens for 10,000 years. When the line about wanting to hold a loved one's face was sung, Leo's eyes grew noticeably red. He wondered if love could truly drive a person to pray for eternity just for one more chance. Even if he had to cross the bridge of the afterlife, his only wish was to hold his lover's face once more. The emotion felt raw and staggering, like the echo of someone lost in the depths of a desperate longing. The song carried a romantic breath that stirred something deep within him, leaving him visibly moved. Turning her head, Sarah seemed to catch sight of Luke standing there, framed by the quiet space of the kitchen. She wondered if this was a true expression of the feelings he kept locked away inside. Could it be that he, too, was waiting for a love that refused to be forgotten? Unsure of the answer, Sarah simply looked back, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Luke continued to listen to the playback of his new song. The production quality this time was, naturally, far superior to his previous efforts. It seemed he hadn't wasted his money on that equipment. She gritted her teeth and opened the comment section. The fans were already reacting, claiming that Luke's new track was absolutely incredible. One commenter exclaimed that the song hadn't disappointed them in the slightest. Another joked that they just wanted to let their ears be blessed by such a heavenly sound. This time, it seemed Luke was bringing a true work of art to the world. On another level, the lyrics spoke of praying to the heavens while stepping down into the mortal world. The song was being praised for its artistry, its richness, and its sheer, overwhelming power. Reading through these amusing and heartfelt comments, Luke couldn't help but break into a smile. In moments like these, we get the sense that he isn't just an ordinary man in charge of his destiny. Perhaps he was using this very piece of art as a way to wait for the love he had lost. The moment was broken when a voice announced that dinner was finally ready for the CEO. Luke's train of thought was abruptly cut short as Sarah immediately fought back against her own rising emotions. He quickly regained his usual indifferent expression and, without another word, turned to leave the room. During dinner, we see Sarah gently asking him about the CEO's plans for the following day. She wondered if he would return tomorrow or if he might need to stay at the hospital for another day. Deep down, Sarah had a feeling that he wouldn't be coming back tomorrow evening, or perhaps not at all. Luke continued eating in silence, his eyes narrowed as if lost in a very specific calculation. In any normal situation, this kind of cold distance was exactly what had happened in the past. She used to beg for his attention, but now, looking at him, he seemed strangely excited about something else. She questioned why she had ever bothered. After dinner, she quickly finished the dishes to be alone. Finally returning to her room, she turned on her tablet and saw that his likes had already surpassed 100,000. She nearly screamed with joy, pacing the room several times while trying to keep her excitement under control. Eventually, she managed to calm herself down and settle into the quiet of the evening. Meanwhile, at the office, the marketing team realized they hadn't made any progress with their current strategy. The manager, Mike, slammed his hand onto the table to get everyone's attention. It was a tense moment, to say the least. He told them that excuses were no longer necessary. What he needed now was a definitive answer. He demanded a solution by the morning meeting, where he expected to hear at least 3 solid proposals. As the meeting ended, Lily's assistant entered the room in a state of visible frustration. She informed the president that an original singer on the short video platform had suddenly been discovered by the public. Everyone was stunned to see that her name was trending everywhere, with 2 of her recent songs going absolutely viral. Lily noted with some irritation that this particular singer had actually been on their platform for 5 years already. Most people had been sticking to covers, but we see that recently, original creation has finally begun again. An uneasy silence filled the room as everyone reached for their phones, and suddenly, the conference room was echoing with the tracks Lonely Warrior and Zickenbeat. To be honest, the vocals were even more impressive than the daily music tracks that had just arrived. The sound quality itself was a bit rough, suggesting it was recorded at home without a professional team behind it. However, this lack of polish didn't dampen the team's growing enthusiasm in the slightest. After all, wasn't this exactly the kind of high-quality original artist they had been searching for? It was like finding a lamp in the dark. They hadn't realized such immense talent was right under their noses. Henry made no effort to hide his excitement as he watched the screen. We learned that the video had only been posted 3 short hours ago. With over 1 million likes already, it was clear this was about to become a life-changing sensation. One of the staff pointed out that the platform's music ranking system was about to be shaken up. We see that artists are typically categorized into tiers S, A, B, and C. Most newcomers are lucky to hit C rank, with only a rare few ever reaching B rank. As for the S rank, that was a level reserved strictly for the industry's biggest superstars. There were only 3 such stars at the moment, but after a long pause, Chris made a bold decision. He proposed a high-level designation, a move that immediately sparked a heated debate about the artist's potential. Chris explained that he had reviewed the artist's previous work, even looking back at his Iron Man projects. While his past singing ability had been mediocre at best, these 2 new songs showed a staggering improvement in skill. It seemed that during his 3-year hiatus, he had been working incredibly hard behind the scenes. Chris concluded by saying he was certain this musician was destined to create something truly legendary. He was absolutely certain that this artist would create something legendary, and if they gave him a top-tier platform, he would surely give them a massive advantage. It would be a return far greater than any standard contract, so he decided to reach out to the artist immediately. After that, Jane ended the meeting and decided to head into the city to arrange a personal meeting. Quietly, she planned to set everything up so they could meet within the next 24 hours. Just as Luke was preparing to head out, he received a call from a completely unfamiliar number. A woman's voice, soft and professional, spoke from the other end of the line. She asked if he was Mr. Luke, and he cautiously confirmed his identity while wondering who she could be. The voice was entirely unfamiliar to him, which was strange, considering how many people he had dealt with in the industry. The caller introduced herself as Jane, the vice president of the music platform. She asked if he was in the city, and Luke suddenly remembered that his likes on the platform had already surpassed 3 million. His popularity was growing at a staggering rate, and it was clear that this was exactly why she was calling him. He confirmed he was in the city, though it seemed the person on the other end didn't quite catch his meaning at first. It wasn't all that surprising, really, considering he had used his real name when he uploaded the tracks. Jane sounded pleased, telling Mr. Luke that they recognized his immense talent and were very eager to collaborate. Jane's voice was buzzing with excitement, and though Luke had important plans that day, she continued to press him for a meeting. She promised it wouldn't take much of his time, so he finally agreed to wait for her. Since she was traveling from quite a distance, they decided to meet at a nearby restaurant in about 20 minutes. When Jane arrived, she was dressed in formal black attire. She was a striking woman, appearing to be in her early 30s. As she looked at Luke, she seemed genuinely taken aback, clearly not expecting him to be so handsome. Luke offered a small, polite smile and invited her to sit, addressing her with the respect her position deserved. She felt there were far more important matters to attend to, and she wondered why they weren't getting straight to them. Jane was practically beaming with joy. To be honest, she couldn't hide how happy she was to finally be there. We see that she wasn't just impressed by his talent, but by the sheer potential he carried within him. One detail in particular left a deep impression on her, even though everything else about the situation seemed like a total mess. She had brought 3 different contracts with her, ranging all the way from B rank to the prestigious S rank. In that very moment, she made the sudden decision to pull out the S rank contract, the best they had to offer. She believed her skills were a perfect match for his, and she told him he likely already knew why she was there. Jane offered a slight smile, explaining that Cool Music wasn't just a platform, but a fully fledged music production company. And so, she presented the S rank contract they had prepared specifically for him. An S-rank contract was the highest level of agreement the company could offer, reserved only for the elite. They intended to place him at the very heart of their operations. She explained that he would have his own studio and a dedicated team of agents and planners at his disposal. After the initial introductions, Luke gestured toward the man he had brought along to the meeting. This was Tom, a trusted friend who had come along specifically to help review the legal details of the contract. Tom proceeded to examine the document with extreme care, checking every single clause multiple times. After a thorough review, Tom gave a small nod and confirmed that there were no issues with the agreement. Seeing this, Luke let out a joyful laugh and thanked Jane for the platform's appreciation of his work. He noted that in the future, they would have to take even greater care of the music they produced together. He was firmly convinced that he had finally moved past the most difficult hurdles of his journey. To keep everything perfectly safe and official, Luke insisted on printing a fresh copy of the new contract. Specialized staff were brought in to coordinate the professional activities surrounding Luke's work in the city. He also noticed that Uncle Chun was holding a pair of shoes in his hands. He felt a bit awkward around the child, and a little later, he said his goodbyes to Ben and Jerry. The Miller family sat down specifically to listen to his new song, which was truly excellent, before he finally had to head out. In the rush of things, he almost forgot that he had promised to treat them all to lunch. That evening, he took the train to the public hall in the suburbs, carrying a small gift and a pack of warm beer. When he reached his destination, he walked quietly through the grounds until he reached a secluded corner of the cemetery. The light there seemed to flicker like a candle, almost as if someone were watching over him. He gently placed the gift down and looked at a photograph. A soft smile touched his face as memories began to surface. "Sarah, I've come to see you again," he whispered, bringing along the familiar scents and her favorite bread. He joked quietly about how she must be getting a bit chubby lately, a small, private joke between them. Her gentle voice seemed to echo in his heart, and he knew all too well how much she hated being alone. He promised himself he would stay by her side all day, and with a quiet sigh, he opened a beer. He asked her how she was doing while he drank his beer and left the bread for her. After a while, he stood up, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against him. He tried to reassure her, and perhaps himself, that he had been doing much better lately. He told her not to worry about him from up there, and then he slowly pulled out his guitar. He gently tuned the strings, and as the moon began to rise, his entire demeanor seemed to shift. The music began to flow, but tears soon blurred his vision, washing over him in an uncontrollable wave. In a low, broken voice, he cried out that he would wait 1,000 years if it meant he could see her just once more. As the night slowly settled in, we see him sharing his doubts and telling her all the stories of everything that had happened lately. By the time the darkness was complete, he hadn't even noticed. He simply lay there, feeling as though he were back in the palm of her hand. That night, he slept with a profound sense of peace, something he hadn't felt in quite a long time. When morning arrived, he looked at her photograph once more and found himself smiling. "Good morning, Sarah," he whispered, asking her if she had slept well through the night. He told her it was time to go, as there were many things to be done, promising to return as soon as he could. A familiar ache began to stir in his chest as he slung his guitar over his back. He placed the empty bags on the ground and, following a silent tradition, took 3 steps backward before turning away. His heart was heavy with the reluctance of leaving, and he began the slow walk back down the mountain path. Suddenly, a pair of bright, familiar eyes appeared before him in the morning light. Something shifted deep within him, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to lose its clarity. He stopped in his tracks, his face etched with a sadness he couldn't hide, and we see Chloe staring at his reddened eyes. To be honest, it wasn't an emotion that could be easily resolved after so much time. "Miss Chloe, what are you doing here?" he asked, turning his head away to quickly brush aside his tears. She explained that her grandmother's resting place was here, and that today was the anniversary of her passing. The whole family had come, she said softly, though she was clearly wondering what had brought him to this secluded spot. In the silence that followed, she tried to gauge his mood, perhaps thinking he just needed a quiet place to rest. She noted that the costs here were much lower than in the city, which was a practical, if somewhat somber, observation. She likely assumed he was considering his current financial situation, given everything he was going through. Chloe looked worried and clearly wanted to comfort him, but she hesitated for a moment before the words finally came out. "Miss Chloe, if you have things to attend to, please be careful," he said, offering a polite but distant warning. He added that he should be leaving as well, as he truly didn't have the time to stay and chat. He spoke softly, and we see Chloe watching him with a heavy heart as he began to walk away. Unable to simply let him go like that, she pulled out her phone and called Lily to tell her what was happening. On the other end of the line, Lily listened as Chloe asked her if she could guess who she had just run into. Chloe asked if she hadn't gone to the memorial park to visit the wall of remembrance herself. "Who was it?" Lily asked, her voice filled with a sudden, sharp excitement at the mention of Luke. Chloe's voice sounded almost playful, but there was a long pause on the other end before Lily spoke again. She wondered what he was doing there so early, and Chloe remarked how tragic it was, considering he was still so young. It seemed he had already chosen his final resting place, a wall where he would eventually remain. Lily's voice rose in sudden shock, her eyes widening as she asked if Chloe was absolutely certain it was him. Chloe felt the weight of the situation, her words reflecting a mix of pity and disbelief at the reality of it all. "Yes, I spoke a few words with him," she confirmed, noting once more how truly unfortunate the circumstances were. She observed that he was all alone here with no one to support him, likely forced to buy a modest spot due to his finances. It was a lonely sight, seeing him there without a single soul by his side to help him through this. He hadn't bought a grand plot, and as she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet regret for him. The instructions he had been following seemed to weigh on him, even as he tried to maintain his composure before the others. It felt as though the heavens themselves were playing a long, cruel joke on his fate. Perhaps he was right to have been so quiet and responsible all those years, never imagining his life would be cut so short. He thought of the Grand Hotel where a hall was being prepared for noon, and upon returning home, he received a letter. The phone rang, and it was Mr. Wong, confirming that the $1 billion had been transferred. Luke thanked him, feeling a sudden, immense wave of relief. With that staggering amount, his grandfather's medical expenses were no longer a concern, and the constant ache of worry finally began to fade. Wang simply smiled, knowing Luke deserved it. Wang then asked if he was free that evening, explaining that his 2 songs had been so well received that the company decided to record studio versions for the music platforms. Wang suggested that if he had time, he'd introduce him to others in the industry. Luke realized he couldn't avoid the pull of work when such opportunities kept finding him. Receiving news like this made him smile for the first time in a long while, filling him with a rare joy as he planned to use the money for the hospital bills first. An hour later, we see him standing in front of the hospital to pay the doctors and settle his grandfather's debt. He hadn't seen Lily for a few days. When he finally saw her, the exhaustion on her face seemed to vanish as she smiled, asking if he'd secured the funds or if she still needed to contact the doctors for him. He accepted a glass of water, feeling deeply grateful for her offer of financial help, even though he hadn't intended to rely on anyone else this time. He hadn't accepted her money, but he would certainly remember her generosity. He then tentatively asked if she had any plans for dinner. He asked if he could treat her, marking the very first time he had ever invited a girl out to eat. To be honest, his heart was racing like a whistle. His heart continued to pound as they stood there. Lily mentioned that the background of his recent work was excellent, and she had been planning to visit him anyway. She was right there, in front of him, right there at the scene of his daily life. Deep down, he felt a surge of gratitude. Now that he had earned some money, he had enough to cover the foreign treatments and his grandmother's medicine with a bit to spare. So, his first thought was to treat her to dinner as a way of saying thank you. He looked relaxed, a bright smile flashing across his face. With a playful glint in her eyes, she teased that his wife should have been the first person he invited. He replied without emotion, noting that his marriage to Chloe was just a contract. He believed that once their cooperation ended, they would return to completely different worlds. It was a sobering thought, really. He told her not to tease him, as he and Chloe didn't belong in the same circle at all. He gave a small, somewhat uneasy laugh as he spoke. He asked again if she would go. She looked at him, her smile deepening as she noted it was his first time inviting a girl out, so of course she would help him out. No matter what happened, they were finally going to dinner. Hearing her accept made him incredibly happy, and he immediately booked a table at the Bridge Courtier Hotel. Luke planned to visit his uncle first before helping Lily tidy up. He chose the Bridge Courtier Hotel, a place famous for its exquisite seafood and elegant French atmosphere. Having finally gathered enough funds, he decided to invite Lily out for a proper meal. It's a lovely feeling to have means, and as they arrived, Lily took her seat by the window. She looked at him with genuine gratitude, praising his talents and thanking him for the invitation. He noticed how her eyes, once clouded with worry over his finances, were finally at peace. Seeing her sincere smile made him truly happy. He raised his glass to Lily, thanking her for the kindness and attention she had shown him over the last 3 years. A sense of deep sincerity was written across his face, born from her disinterested help during his darkest times. But suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the air. We see Chloe and her friend Sarah entering the dining area. Sarah moved toward him, her voice dripping with indignation as she demanded to know if Luke felt no shame being out like this. Lily and Luke were momentarily stunned into silence by this sudden, absurd confrontation. Lily eventually spoke up, reminding Sarah that this was a public place and to watch her tone. Chloe's gaze was as sharp as a blade, though a flicker of something else crossed her eyes. Luke stood up with a calm smile, greeting Chloe and acknowledging her presence at the hotel. Knowing how tense things could get, Lily tried to explain the situation. She assured Chloe that she and Luke were just friends and that there was nothing more to it. But Sarah wasn't having it, pushing the issue further. She mockingly asked what else you call a man and a woman dining alone together, if not something suspicious. Luke felt he couldn't take much more of this. It was supposed to be a simple meal of gratitude. Sarah continued to glare, rolling her eyes while Chloe watched the scene unfold. Looking at Chloe, he chose to keep his voice quiet and steady. Deep down, he knew he was no longer the man bound by that contract. Their worlds had already drifted apart. With the contract nearing its end and his own life reaching its final chapter, he felt that explanations were just a waste of breath. Some things were better left unsaid. However, he hadn't expected Chloe to actually be affected. She asked him, with visible irritation, if he wasn't even going to try and explain their relationship. Her words caught him off guard. He then heard Sarah's protective remarks as she stepped in, claiming she would defend Chloe's interests against him. Chloe seemed disappointed, perhaps feeling as though her territory was being invaded. Luke's silence only seemed to bruise her pride further, leaving the air heavy with tension. He found it hard to imagine why Chloe would care now. When they signed the contract, she had explicitly stated he could see whoever he liked, as long as the marriage remained a formality. He didn't want to cause a scene, especially considering her complicated and strict relationship with her business partner, Jake. He figured she was likely just trying to save face in front of her peers. To be honest, it wasn't the right time for this. He took a breath, preparing to finally explain. But he was interrupted by yet another sudden voice. It was Jake, walking toward them with a look of unbridled joy on his face, surprised to see Chloe there. We see Jake approaching with a smile that seems a bit too practiced, accompanied by a few others who all share that same forced cheerfulness. With all our main players gathered, Jake began inviting everyone to join them, though this was certainly not the turn of events Luke had expected. Jake walked toward Chloe with a grin, calling out a warm greeting to her as the other actors followed suit, eager to acknowledge the beautiful investor. He asked what they were celebrating, but Chloe felt a bitter chill in the air and her response was noticeably cold. She remarked on how cold it had been lately, noting that everyone was working hard, especially since she had invited them to stay in touch. Jake continued speaking, his gaze shifting toward Luke as if measuring him up in that moment. He asked Chloe if they had already eaten, wondering aloud why they hadn't reached out to join the larger group. He grew more excited as the crowd gathered, but before Chloe could answer, Sarah let out a gasp of genuine surprise. She stepped closer, realizing that Luke was also there, standing right in the middle of this awkward reunion. Even though he hadn't participated in the recent showcase, Sarah admitted that Luke had provided her with a great deal of help. She spoke of the inspirations he provided, noting that the character he helped with was incredibly creative and well-developed. Sarah smiled faintly as she introduced Luke's former role as King John, a part he unfortunately couldn't perform due to his circumstances. She told the group that despite his unassuming appearance, his acting skills were truly top-tier and unmatched. Luke found it hard not to smile at the irony. Sarah was suddenly praising him far more than he ever expected. However, he could still sense her underlying disdain for others, even if she was being kind to him for the moment. Naturally, he had no desire to waste his warmth on people who had treated him with such coldness in the past. Seeing that they hadn't even started their meal, Jake suggested that they all sit together and join the party. He mentioned that there were still a few business matters he wanted to discuss with Chloe while they were all there. Sarah enthusiastically seconded the invitation, while Chloe simply pursed her lips in a thin, silent line. Of course, Luke knew exactly who Sarah was and what she was capable of, making this invitation feel like a trap. She was a prominent leading lady in the entertainment industry, a world where appearances are everything. She often seemed solitary, and one had to wonder if her friendship was something he could truly handle. Her friendly demeanor toward him was clear, though it seemed to make Chloe feel a bit uneasy. This put him in a difficult position, especially since this was a private dinner for her film crew. He didn't feel he quite belonged there, even if her production was undeniably high quality. Regardless, they all moved in the same professional circles, which made avoiding them nearly impossible. Sarah spoke cheerfully about meeting up later, giving him no real chance to decline the invitation. He watched Chloe's strained smile and couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort on her behalf. As it turned out, Sarah had actually been quite supportive of him in her own way. Chloe mentioned that when his role had changed, Sarah had even gone so far as to speak with the director. When the group finally settled in, Chloe took a seat on the left, flanked by Sarah and young Leo. This effectively blocked Jake from sitting next to her, though she politely told him to find a seat. Chloe stood up then, her smile carrying a depth that was hard to read. He had no desire to involve himself with the director, nearly forgetting that Jake was her boyfriend. Jake sat beside Chloe, assuring her it was fine, while the rumors of their relationship had already begun to spread. The entire crew was buzzing, watching as Jake tried his best to put his affection for Chloe on full display. Luke simply lowered his head to check his phone, acting as if none of this drama concerned him. Chloe kept glancing his way, and seeing him so quiet only seemed to increase her growing restlessness. However, without any warning, the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. Sarah stood up abruptly, her expression turning icy as she looked across the table. Sarah looked directly at Director Liu, her voice trembling as she asked what on earth he could possibly mean. Her frustration was impossible to miss, and suddenly, every eye in the room was fixed on the unfolding drama. With a heavy silence hanging over the table, she questioned the director with a newfound sternness. She asked if he truly dared to treat everyone with such blatant disregard, especially Luke's own wife. It seemed she was wondering if he had mistaken her for someone who would simply stay silent. She couldn't believe he was still attempting to handle the situation, and Luke himself, in such a manipulative way. As she continued to speak with such intensity, a heavy, awkward hush fell over the entire room. The whispers began. Apparently, Director Liu was already married, yet here she was, seemingly pursuing another man. It was the kind of scandal people loved to gossip about, wealthy women playing dangerous games behind their husbands' backs. In that single moment, the way everyone viewed Director Liu became far more complicated and judgmental. On the surface, Liu had always seemed like a woman driven by her passions and whims. While the guests tried to keep their faces neutral, the director's own expression had turned incredibly grim. We see Luke stand up, watching as Liu's eyes fill with a frantic, agitated energy she can no longer hide. He tried to tell her to stop, never imagining she would turn her mounting frustration directly toward him. Deep down, he felt a strange mix of being moved by the defense and anxious about what would happen next. Ultimately, he had no desire for this complicated mess to be seen as some sort of public acknowledgement of their ties. It appeared that both he and Director Liu had already reached their own conclusions about the matter. Chloe looked at him with visible discomfort, telling Luke she knew he meant well, but couldn't watch him get hurt. She stood firm, telling the director that while she respected her family's power, she wouldn't stand by idly. She reminded everyone that since the director was a married woman, she had a moral obligation to respect those boundaries. She wanted to understand those feelings, wondering if she could ever truly find a sense of peace. Since she felt nothing at all, she wondered why she didn't simply choose to get a divorce. With Director Liu's beauty and status, there wasn't a man in the world she couldn't have. It made little sense to lash out at someone so genuinely kind, which, to be honest, was quite baffling. She demanded an explanation, and the tension in the air became instantly suffocating. The room felt small, and for a moment, the only sound we could hear was the rhythm of breathing. Because of her connection to Director Liu, a woman known for her volatility, no one dared to speak. A wave of disgust and silent tears filled the hearts of those watching the scene unfold. She had a husband waiting at home, yet here she was, involving herself with such strange company. It was truly absurd, especially considering the kind of woman Director Liu claimed to be. Jane's expression soured as she realized she had been dragged into Director Liu's personal drama. She stood up immediately, knowing that if these rumors spread, the internet would likely explode by morning. She could already predict tomorrow's headlines, but then Director Liu said something Jane never expected.